had always loved hiking, the kind of hiking where you leave your phone behind, where the world fades away, and you only hear the wind through the trees and the occasional call of a bird. This time, I decided to take a weekend trip to a trail I'd never done before. It was located about 4 hours from my house, tucked away in the mountains, with no signs of large crowds or well-known landmarks, just a quiet, peaceful place. I woke up early on a Saturday, packed my bag with the essentials: water, a few snacks, a first aid kit, and my trusty map. The weather was perfect, sunny with a slight chill in the air. I knew it was going to be a good day, the kind of day when you feel like the world is at your feet. The drive to the trailhead was uneventful. As I neared the mountains, the landscape changed, and the dense trees started to creep closer to the road. I pulled up to the small parking lot near the entrance to the trail, which was almost completely empty except for a couple of cars. I was alone, but I didn't mind. In fact, I preferred it that way. Less noise, less distraction. Just me, the trees, and the earth beneath my boots. The trailhead was marked by a simple wooden sign. Riverbend Trail, it read. I checked my map once more to confirm the route. The trail was supposed to be about a 5-hour hike, taking me through some dense forest and along a river that would eventually lead me to a small overlook with a view of the valley below. Sounded perfect. I set off. The beginning of the trail was easy. The path was wide, well-trodden, and gently sloped, perfect for warming up. Birds chirped in the trees above, and the leaves crunched under my boots. The further I walked, the more I felt the world quiet down around me. There was no one else on the trail. The air was still, and the only sound was the rhythm of my footsteps and the rustling of leaves as I brushed past them. I took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill my lungs. It didn't take long for the trail to narrow and become less defined. The forest closed in around me. I could see the river below, barely audible, its sound drowned out by the dense trees and the wind. I had been hiking for about an hour when the first sign of something unusual caught my attention. I was crossing a small bridge over a creek when I saw something strange on the far side of the bank. At first, I thought it was just an odd pile of rocks, but as I got closer, I realized it was something else entirely. The shape was unnatural. Something didn't sit right about it. I couldn't place it, but there was a sense of unease that settled over me. I stopped in my tracks, staring at the pile, my instincts telling me to turn back. But I didn't. I walked closer. It was a stack of branches, but not just any stack. These were carefully arranged, almost deliberately, in a way that felt too purposeful for something random. They weren't just thrown together. They were shaped, twisted, bent, and woven in a way that made them look like a crude sort of structure. It wasn't large, maybe 3 feet high, but the way it was arranged made it seem like it could be something far more significant than it appeared. I stood there for a moment, studying it. I wasn't sure why, but I reached down and touched one of the branches. It was cold, almost unnaturally so, as if it had been left out for much longer than it should have been. I stepped back, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck rise. I shook my head and told myself it was probably nothing. A shelter made by someone else hiking the trail, or maybe an animal that had been gathering materials. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I didn't want to dwell on it, so I forced myself to keep going. I crossed the bridge, continuing along the trail. The next few miles were quiet, too quiet. The trail became steeper, and I was forced to focus on my footing. My mind began to wander, and I found myself thinking more about the strange pile of branches. I tried to tell myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe a group of hikers had built it, or maybe it was just part of the natural order of things. But then I started noticing other things. As I continued up the trail, I saw more signs that something was amiss. Small disturbances along the path, broken branches that didn't look like they'd fallen naturally, rocks placed in odd positions, and patches of disturbed earth that seemed too deliberate to be the result of animal activity. It wasn't much, but the pattern was becoming clear. Something or someone had been here recently, and they were making their presence known. Around midday, I reached a point on the trail where the trees began to thin out, and I could hear the river more clearly. The sound of the flowing water was oddly soothing, and I felt a sense of calm wash over me. I decided to stop and take a break, sitting on a large rock by the river's edge. I unzipped my bag and pulled out a sandwich and some water, sitting quietly for a few minutes. The calm didn't last long, though. Just as I was finishing my break, I heard something, a faint sound, almost like a footstep, came from behind me somewhere in the woods. I froze. Could have been an animal, maybe a deer or something else. But something about it didn't feel right. I didn't turn around immediately. Instead, I sat still, listening. The sound was distant, but unmistakable. It was like someone was moving through the woods deliberately, but not in a hurry. It wasn't an animal. It was a person. I stood up quickly, my heart starting to race. I looked down the trail in both directions, but saw nothing. No movement, no signs of life. The woods were quiet again, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I could feel it like a pressure on my chest. Something was out there. For the next hour, I continued hiking, my pace quickening. I was no longer enjoying the hike. My every sense was heightened, alert to every noise, every rustling in the trees. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the path. I didn't know why, but I felt as if I was being followed. The sense of dread was creeping in, slowly at first, but now it was all-consuming. My feet were moving faster, as though I was trying to outrun whatever I thought was behind me. By the time I reached the overlook, the sun had nearly set. The view was breathtaking, just like the map had promised. A wide expanse of valley below, the fading light casting a golden hue over the landscape. But I couldn't focus on it. All I could think about was the feeling of being watched, the strange pile of branches, and the distant footsteps. I wasn't alone out here, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I stayed at the overlook for only a few minutes before I turned back. The thought of staying out here alone in the dark was unbearable now. The last thing I wanted was to be caught out here when night fell. I started the long trek back down the trail, moving faster than I had earlier, trying to keep my mind focused on the path. The feeling of being followed never left. Every step I took felt like someone else was right behind me, just out of sight. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and quick, as I pushed myself to move faster. The shadows of the trees seemed to grow longer, and the noises of the forest. Every creak of the branches, every rustling of leaves, sounded too loud, too close. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone there, but the path was always empty. The silence was oppressive, and the weight of it made me feel like I was being suffocated. The longer I hiked, the more I felt the sense of danger closing in around me. Then, just as I was beginning to feel like I couldn't take it anymore, I saw the parking lot in the distance. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't alone anymore. I wasn't being followed. But I felt a deep sense of relief that I was finally out of the woods, back where there were other people, other signs of life. When I reached the parking lot, I saw the same two cars that had been there when I arrived. The place was still as empty as it had been when I first arrived. I didn't stop to check the cars or look for any signs of life. I just put my bag in the trunk and drove away, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, my mind racing. I never returned to that trail. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stumbled onto something out there in the woods, something I wasn't supposed to see. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe it wasn't. I'll never know. But I do know one thing for sure. Sometimes, it's better to leave certain things unexplored. The sun had barely crested the mountains when I started my hike. I had prepared for this trip for weeks, reading maps, packing gear, double-checking supplies. It was just supposed to be a simple solo hike, something to clear my head, quick getaway. I wasn't expecting anything unusual, but that's how things often start, right? Ordinary until they aren't. The trail I was following led into the dense woods of a secluded area in the mountains. I had heard it wasn't the most popular route, which was partly why I chose it. I wanted to avoid crowds, just the peace of nature and my thoughts. The air was crisp, still fresh from the morning dew, and the scent of pine and damp earth was thick around me. It felt good to breathe, the kind of clean, almost sharp air that fills your lungs and makes you feel alive. I walked for a few hours, the path winding through trees and over rocky outcrops. It wasn't a difficult trail, not by any means, but the terrain was rougher than I'd expected in some places. The thick underbrush and narrow, twisting path demanded my full attention. But that was fine, kept my mind occupied. I checked my watch. It was nearly noon. I hadn't seen anyone else so far, but I wasn't really surprised by that. The area was known for being remote, with only the most serious hikers venturing here. I had the sense of being alone in a vast, untamed world, and in that solitude, I felt small but at the same time oddly empowered. It was just me and the wilderness. The trail started to narrow as I moved deeper into the woods. The trees became denser, their trunks thicker, and the shadows longer. The sun, which had been shining brightly earlier, was now mostly blocked by the canopy above. I had to slow down a little, watching my step more carefully now as the path grew more uneven. It was clear that few people came this way. I reached a fork in the trail after another hour. There was a sign, but it was worn down, the lettering barely legible. One direction led toward a scenic overlook, according to the faded map on the sign, and the other deeper into the forest. I'd read about both of them, but my focus was on the more secluded route, the one less traveled. I figured it was the one with the more rewarding views. I took the less trodden path. The further I went, the more the forest seemed to close in around me. I passed by a creek where the water moved fast, splashing over smooth rocks. I stopped to take a drink, cupping my hands and letting the cool water run over my fingers before sipping. The taste of fresh, unfiltered water was something you can't really appreciate until you're deep in the wilderness like this. I continued on, my feet crunching against the dry leaves and twigs underfoot. The air had begun to cool, and the trail became steeper. I had to climb over a few fallen trees, their trunks thick and tangled in the undergrowth. At times, I had to use my hands to steady myself, pushing off branches or roots that threatened to trip me. It wasn't difficult, but it was enough to keep my attention on what I was doing. Hiking this far off the beaten path meant being alert. Then it happened. I'd been climbing for a while when I reached an area where the path seemed to disappear. One moment I was following it just fine, and the next I was standing in front of a large boulder that appeared to block the way. I circled around it, searching for the trail again, but the more I looked, the more I realized something was wrong. The terrain here seemed different than what I had seen earlier. It wasn't as well worn. I should have noticed that sooner, but I had been so focused on pushing forward that I hadn't paid close attention. I retraced my steps a little, thinking the trail might have veered off somewhere, but there was no sign of it. The trees grew thicker in this part of the woods, the canopy even denser, and the whole area felt quieter. I couldn't hear any birds or animals anymore, just the sound of my breath and the rustling of leaves. It was strange, unnerving almost. I checked my map. I had no reception, of course. It was a dead zone up here, and that's exactly what I wanted when I started. But now it was becoming a little uncomfortable. I was used to reading maps, but in this moment it wasn't helping. I scanned the area. The creek was somewhere behind me, and I thought about going back to it, but that felt like the wrong move. I decided to keep going. I hadn't gotten this far to turn back. The trees seemed to close in even more as I walked, their branches low, the light now dimming rapidly. The coolness in the air grew thicker. That familiar sense of peace was gone, replaced with a nagging feeling that something was off. I pressed on, knowing the way I had been going was the right path, even if it didn't look like it anymore. Maybe this part of the forest was just more isolated than the others. I had the sense of being watched, and it made my skin crawl, but I pushed that thought aside. There were no people out here, no reason to be paranoid. That's when I heard it, the snap of a twig. I froze. It wasn't the kind of sound an animal would make, at least not the small, forest-dwelling creatures I was familiar with. This was heavier, deliberate. Someone was out here with me. My heart pounded as I tried to make sense of it. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe it was another hiker? I had passed a couple of marked campsites earlier, and there were always other people on the trails around this time of year. But the more I listened, the more I realized that the noise hadn't come from behind me. It was ahead, off to my left. I stood still, straining my ears. The forest was unnaturally quiet now. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. Then, another noise, a movement in the underbrush. I couldn't see what it was, but I was sure now that someone, or something, was nearby. I turned slowly, trying to stay calm. My hand reached for my backpack, where I kept my knife. It was a precaution, not something I liked to rely on, but it made me feel better. There were no wild animals up here I had to worry about, but the thought of someone lurking out of sight was unsettling. I started walking again, but I did it slowly, deliberately. My mind raced. Could it be a person? It wasn't like I was in a popular area, but who else would be out here? What would they be doing this far off the trail? Then I heard it again, closer this time, a rustling in the bushes to my left, and then a low, gravelly voice that sent a chill down my spine. Not in the way you might imagine, but more in a way that made me question everything around me. It was soft, too far away to make out, but the words, I couldn't make them out, but the tone made my skin crawl. It wasn't right. None of this was right. Panic started to rise in my chest, but I shoved it down. I wasn't going to let fear control me. I had to stay rational. I had to think clearly, quicken my pace, but then I stumbled. My foot caught on a root, and I nearly fell face first into the dirt. My heart raced now, my breath coming quicker, more shallow. I pushed myself to my feet and kept going, moving faster but trying to keep quiet. The noises had stopped, but I knew that didn't mean it was over. The silence was even worse. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was tracking me. I glanced around, feeling more and more like I was in the middle of a trap. I needed to get out. The trail had to be close. It had to be. Then I heard it again, the snap of a branch. Not behind me this time, but directly ahead. I didn't think. I just ran. I wasn't even sure where I was going at first, but I knew I had to get out of that forest. I could feel the branches scratching at my arms, the ground uneven underfoot, but I didn't care. I couldn't hear anything behind me, but I didn't stop to check. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of running, I burst into a clearing, and there, in the distance, I saw the trail again. The familiar, worn path. I didn't stop to look back. I just ran for it. My legs burned with exhaustion, my breath ragged and painful. But the moment my foot hit the main trail, I felt a rush of relief. I stopped, gasping for air, and turned around, looking back toward the woods. There was nothing. The forest was still and silent. I took a few deep breaths, trying to calm myself. My mind was racing, trying to process what had happened, what I had heard, the strange noises, the feeling that something was out there watching me. But no matter how many times I looked back, there was no sign of anyone, no movement in the trees. I stood there for a long time, heart still pounding, before I finally made my way back down the trail. The rest of the hike was uneventful. I didn't see anyone. I didn't hear any more strange noises. By the time I reached the parking lot, I felt like a weight had been lifted off my chest. The woods had let me go. Looking back, I can't explain what happened that day. Maybe it was my imagination. Maybe it was something else. But I know one thing for sure, I wasn't going back there again. And I've never felt more grateful for the sound of a car engine in my life. I had always been the type of person who found solace in the wilderness. Growing up in a small town, the dense woods and trails around the area had always been my escape. The quiet, the clean air, the sense of isolation, it all felt like a balm to my busy mind. So, when I had a free weekend, I decided to go on a solo hiking trip in a remote part of the forest. The plan was simple. I would hike along an old trail I'd been curious about for a while. The map showed it leading into some very secluded areas, far from any marked campsites or tourist trails. I didn't mind the solitude. I actually preferred it. I packed my bag carefully, making sure to bring enough food, water, and gear. I wasn't planning on staying overnight, but I always liked being prepared just in case. The morning of the hike was crisp, the air cold enough to warrant a light jacket, but the sun was breaking through the trees as I started my journey. The trailhead was located at the edge of a small clearing, framed by towering pines that seemed to close in as I walked deeper into the forest. There were no other cars in the parking area, no signs of life except for the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. As I moved along the trail, I could hear the crunch of dirt and fallen leaves beneath my boots. The path was narrow, winding through the trees in sharp turns and sudden drops. It was a bit overgrown in places, but nothing too difficult to navigate. The forest around me was dense, the canopy thick enough to block most of the sun's rays, casting a dappled light on the ground. I had been walking for a few hours when I realized the silence was almost too complete. There were no birds, no insects buzzing around, not even the usual sounds of small animals scurrying through the underbrush. The air felt still, almost unnaturally so. I stopped for a moment, scanning my surroundings. The trees were tall, their trunks gnarled and covered in moss, but there was something unsettling about the emptiness of the place. It wasn't right, but I chalked it up to my own nerves. After all, I'd been hiking alone before. I decided to press on, telling myself that it was just the isolation making me feel this way. But as the hours passed, the unease only grew. I came across a part of the trail that looked like it had been disturbed. The ground was torn up, and branches were broken, scattered haphazardly across the path. I paused, unsure of what to make of it. It didn't seem like an animal had caused the damage. It was too clean, too deliberate. My heart rate picked up as I took a few cautious steps forward, scanning the area for any signs of what might have happened. I had seen plenty of wildlife before, even the occasional large animal like deer or moose, but this was different. There was a sense of wrongness here, like something had passed through this area that didn't belong. I moved quickly past the wreckage, my thoughts racing. There had to be a logical explanation. Could have been a storm or something natural. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The rest of the hike went on in tense silence. The further I went, the more isolated I felt. The path had started to narrow even more, and the trees seemed to press in tighter, blocking out the last of the light. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was a gnawing, uncomfortable sensation, something just on the edge of my awareness. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild in the solitude. When I came across a small creek, I decided it would be a good place to rest. I knelt by the water, unzipped my pack, and pulled out a sandwich and some water. The sound of the water flowing over rocks was soothing, almost meditative, but the feeling of being watched never quite left. I glanced over my shoulder every few minutes, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. After about an hour, I packed up and continued down the trail. By now, the sky was beginning to turn a soft orange, signaling that the sun was starting to set. The trail should have looped back around soon, but I didn't recognize the area. The trees seemed different now, the forest more oppressive. The path was growing fainter, and I found myself having to push through thicker undergrowth. It was at this point that I saw something I shouldn't have. There was a figure standing just off the trail, partially obscured by the thick underbrush. At first, I thought it might have been another hiker, but as I looked more closely, I realized it wasn't moving. It stood there, perfectly still, just out of clear view. My heart slammed in my chest. I froze, unsure of what to do. It was a person, or at least it looked like one. But something about the way they stood, motionless, unnaturally still, made the hairs on my arms stand up. I called out, but there was no response. I took a few slow steps forward, trying to get a better look, but as soon as I did, the figure disappeared into the trees. It was like it had melted into the shadows, vanishing in the blink of an eye. My heart pounded in my chest. It was probably nothing, just a trick of the light or the stress of being out here alone for so long. I took a deep breath and tried to push the thought out of my mind. But the rest of the hike was nothing like I had expected. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was following me. Every time I glanced behind me, the trail was empty, but the unease lingered. The silence felt deeper now, more suffocating. As I pushed through the underbrush, the trees started to thin, and I came to a small clearing. In the center of it stood a structure, a cabin of sorts. It wasn't marked on the map, and it looked old, dilapidated. The windows were shattered, the roof sagging under the weight of years of neglect. I wasn't sure why I even approached it. Part of me wanted to turn back, but another part of me, curious, maybe even driven by some unexplainable urge, moved forward. I reached the door and pushed it open, the hinges creaking loudly as it swung inward. The interior was dark, dusty, and smelled of rot, but what caught my attention was the collection of old gear piled in one corner. There were camping tools, sleeping bags, and some old, frayed rope. My heart skipped a beat. It was like someone had been living here, at least recently. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me, a branch snapping. I turned around, but the clearing was empty. My breath quickened. I hadn't imagined it. Someone was out there, and I wasn't alone. I grabbed my pack, slinging it over my shoulder, and rushed toward the edge of the clearing, heart racing. As I emerged from the woods and back onto the trail, I saw the sun was setting fast. There was no time to lose. I needed to get back to my car before darkness fully fell. The path was unfamiliar, but I pushed myself harder, trying not to think of the things lurking in the woods. I was almost at the point of no return when I heard footsteps. Behind me, following me, faster now and unmistakably close. My panic spiked, and I broke into a sprint, my legs burning, my breath ragged. I didn't look back, not until I reached the clearing where the trailhead should have been. The parking lot was just ahead, and I could see my car in the distance. But when I reached it, I froze. My car wasn't alone. There was another vehicle parked nearby, dark, nondescript. I hadn't seen it when I'd parked earlier. Someone was waiting, watching, but this time I didn't wait to find out who. I jumped into my car, started it, and sped off, the forest disappearing in my rearview mirror. As I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being followed. I glanced in my mirrors repeatedly, but there was nothing behind me, just the darkening road stretching out into the distance. I made it home without any further incident, but the unease never really left. The silence in the woods had been too much, and the abandoned cabin, the strange figure. It all kept replaying in my mind. I couldn't explain it, but deep down, I knew one thing. I wasn't supposed to be out there. That night, I found myself looking over my shoulder more than once, as if something was still watching. I decided to go on a solo hike. It wasn't something I did often, but the idea of being alone in the woods had a certain appeal to it. The quiet, the solitude, the way everything felt so raw and real, like I could just forget about the world for a while. I had been working nonstop for the past few weeks, and I needed this. It wasn't a long hike, just a day trip, but it would give me the time I needed to clear my head. I had picked a trail I'd heard about from a few friends who'd hiked it before. It was supposed to be beautiful, a mix of open meadows and dense forest, winding through hills and along a stream. I checked my gear the night before: water, snacks, a compass, a map, and a fully charged phone. Not that I expected to need it, it was supposed to be a straightforward trail. But still, I didn't want to be careless. I started early in the morning, before the sun had fully risen, thinking it would be peaceful to get a head start. The air was cool, the kind of cool that still felt fresh. I could see my breath when I exhaled, and that made me smile. The world was still sleeping, and the only sounds were the birds waking up and the soft crunch of my boots on the trail. There were no other hikers around when I started, but that didn't bother me. It was nice, in fact. The solitude felt comforting, like the world was mine for the taking. The first hour was smooth. The trail was easy, not too steep, not too muddy. I passed through some dense woods where the trees formed a canopy above, blocking most of the early sunlight. It made the world feel a little smaller, and the shadows played tricks on my eyes. I'd hear the occasional rustle in the underbrush, a squirrel or maybe a rabbit. It didn't bother me. I liked the idea of wildlife watching me, even if I couldn't see them. At one point, the trail opened up to a small clearing. The sun was just starting to rise higher, and the golden light bounced off the tall grasses. It was stunning. I stopped to drink some water, looking out at the view. A stream ran nearby, its water clear and cold, cutting through the meadow like a vein of silver. It was the kind of place that made you stop and take a breath appreciating the silence and the way the world moved around you. I felt a sense of peace then, but it was a fleeting peace, like the calm before the storm. The trail dipped back into the forest shortly after, and that's when I started to feel off. It wasn't anything specific, but the air felt heavier. The birds had stopped singing, and the wind didn't seem to stir the leaves as much anymore. The forest had grown quieter. I tried to shake off the feeling. Maybe it was just my imagination, but the more I walked, the more the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It wasn't like I was hearing things. I didn't hear footsteps behind me or voices whispering through the trees, but there was a sense of being watched, a subtle pressure, like the woods were closing in around me. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting someone to be there, but there was nothing, just trees, just the long, winding path ahead of me. I kept going, telling myself I was being ridiculous. I was alone in the woods, and there were no other hikers in sight. The trail was empty. It was just me and the trees and the occasional rustle in the bushes. But then something caught my eye. It was a movement, quick but noticeable. I froze, squinting into the trees. There was nothing there, just shadows. It happened again, this time a little further ahead. I couldn't see what it was, but I could feel it. Something watching me, something out there. I moved forward, my pace quicker now. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting someone to step out from behind a tree. But there was no one, just the sound of my boots crunching on the dirt. The trail started to get steeper as I climbed higher into the hills. I could hear the sound of the stream below, the rushing water now muffled by the distance. The trees were thicker here, and the air felt even heavier. My breath was coming a little faster, but I told myself it was because of the incline. But then I heard it again, a snap of a twig, clear as day. I stopped and turned around, staring into the woods behind me. Nothing, just trees, shadows, and that sinking feeling in my stomach. Couldn't shake it, the feeling of being followed, of something lurking just out of sight. I wasn't paranoid. At least I didn't think I was. I told myself it was just the woods playing tricks on me. It was early in the morning, and I had barely seen another soul on the trail. Maybe someone had passed by and I hadn't noticed. I tried to keep my thoughts focused on the trail ahead, but the sounds from behind were growing more frequent now. Every so often, I would hear another snap or the rustle of branches. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was moving just out of sight. My heart was pounding, my senses on high alert. Then I heard it, a sound unlike any I had heard before, a deep, guttural grunt. It came from the forest behind me, far enough away that I couldn't pinpoint exactly where it had come from, but close enough to send a chill down my spine. I started to walk faster, my feet carrying me up the trail at a quick pace. The trail was becoming more difficult to navigate, rocky and uneven. The trees were denser, their branches reaching out like fingers. I couldn't see very far ahead anymore, and the feeling of being followed only intensified. I rounded a bend in the trail, and there, up ahead, was something that caught my attention. A small clearing, but more importantly, a small cabin. It was old, barely standing, its walls cracked and faded, but it was there, sitting quietly among the trees. I had no idea how I had missed it before. It didn't make any sense. There was no mention of a cabin on the map or in any of the descriptions of the trail. I didn't stop. I kept walking, but now, I was even more aware of the strange sounds behind me. The twigs snapping, the rustling of leaves, and the occasional grunt. I started to run, my breathing heavy, my mind racing. The cabin wasn't far, but the feeling of something following me was undeniable now. Whatever it was, it wasn't human. I reached the cabin in a matter of minutes, my heart racing. The door was slightly ajar, creaking in the wind. I didn't care about the cabin. I just wanted to get to safety. But as I stepped closer, I saw something. A figure in the window. A tall figure. Someone or something was inside. I didn't wait. I turned and bolted back the way I came, not caring about the trail anymore. I didn't want to be anywhere near that cabin. The rustling behind me was louder now, closer. Something was gaining on me. I could hear its breath, heavy and labored, like it was running just as fast as I was. I couldn't keep up the pace for much longer. My legs were burning, my chest tight. I needed to find shelter. I needed to find somewhere to hide. My mind was clouded, panic setting in as the sounds grew louder. Then I saw it, the clearing where I had stopped earlier, the stream cutting through it like a ribbon. I dashed toward it, hoping the water would mask my scent or confuse whatever was chasing me. I reached the clearing and stopped. There was nowhere to hide, no cover, just open space and the stream. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath ragged, but the sounds had stopped. The rustling, the grunts, everything had gone silent. I waited, listening, but there was nothing. Felt wrong. Everything felt wrong. I glanced over my shoulder one last time, half expecting something to appear from the woods, but nothing did. The forest was still. I didn't know what had been chasing me or why it had stopped. Maybe it was a wild animal, maybe it wasn't. But at that moment, I realized just how vulnerable I had been, how close I had come to something I couldn't even understand. I took a deep breath and started walking back toward the trailhead. I didn't look back, not even once. The rest of the hike was a blur. I just wanted to get out of the woods, away from whatever had been following me. By the time I made it back to the trailhead, the sun was high in the sky. The peaceful silence of the woods had returned, but it was no longer comforting. I had seen the woods for what they truly were: unpredictable, dangerous, and far less forgiving than I had ever realized. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew what I had experienced, and I was glad to be leaving. I woke up early on a Saturday morning, the sun just starting to break through the trees outside my cabin. The kind of day that beckons you to go outside, to get lost in the wilderness and breathe in the fresh, cool air. I had decided the night before to go on a hike. Something simple, something familiar. Nothing too strenuous, just a few hours in the woods to clear my mind. I'd hiked this trail many times before, but today, for some reason, it felt different. I couldn't explain why, but I had an odd feeling in my gut. I packed a small bag, water, snacks, a jacket in case the weather changed, my phone for safety. I wasn't going to go off the grid entirely, just a few miles in and out. The trailhead was a short drive from my cabin, and the area was known for its serenity. I'd walked it countless times, and yet, as I locked the door behind me and walked to the car, something gnawed at the back of my mind. The drive was uneventful, the kind where you don't notice time passing until you realize you've arrived. I pulled up to the parking lot near the trailhead. It was empty, which wasn't unusual for an early morning, but for some reason, the emptiness struck me as odd. Normally, there would be at least one or two cars, maybe a family or a couple setting out for a weekend hike. Today, nothing. I shrugged off the feeling. I was here to get some fresh air and enjoy the solitude. I grabbed my pack, slung it over my shoulder, and started down the well-marked trail. The dirt was still cool from the night, and the trees around me towered above, their thick branches creating a canopy that filtered the early sunlight into a soft, golden glow. The air smelled of pine and earth, and the quiet was absolute. The only sound was the rhythmic crunch of my boots on the path. For the first few miles, everything felt normal. The trail wound through a mix of dense forest and open patches where the trees had been cleared in the past for logging or fire breaks. I didn't mind the open spaces. They made me feel less claustrophobic and gave me a chance to take in the landscape. I passed a few small streams, the water gurgling over rocks, and noticed a couple of deer tracks in the soft mud along the trail. I wasn't bothered by wildlife. I'd encountered everything from squirrels to bears on previous hikes, and I knew how to handle each situation. Keep your distance, make your presence known, and if you don't provoke them, they'll leave you alone. As I moved deeper into the woods, though, I started to feel the oddness creeping back in. The trail, which had been well maintained and clear at first, began to look less traveled. The undergrowth was thicker than usual and the path narrowed. I kept going, not wanting to turn back just yet, but the sensation of being watched began to grow stronger. My skin tingled, and my senses seemed to heighten. Every rustle in the bushes, every snap of a twig underfoot, made me pause for a moment, scanning my surroundings. I tried to ignore it. I had a long hike ahead, and there was no reason to get paranoid over nothing. But as I pushed forward, I noticed something strange. The silence. The kind of silence that comes before a storm, or perhaps after something unsettling has occurred. There were no birds, no squirrels scurrying up trees, no wind rustling through the leaves. It was as if everything around me had gone still, frozen in place. I quickened my pace, hoping the feeling would pass. Didn't, and then I saw something that stopped me cold. A small, makeshift shelter. A tarp stretched between two trees, some kind of lean-to with a fire pit in front of it. The fire pit was cold, no recent signs of life. But the shelter, it hadn't been there the last time I hiked this trail. That much I was sure of. The trail was used by a lot of weekend hikers, and there was no way something like that could have been built so quickly. It was clear that someone had been living here, or at least staying for extended periods of time. My heart rate sped up, and I found myself scanning the area around me. Was someone here? I walked closer to the shelter, not sure what I was looking for. A backpack, a discarded jacket, anything that would tell me if someone had been here recently. But there was nothing. The site was deserted, abandoned. I hesitated. I had no reason to be worried, no concrete reason to think that I was in danger. But as I stood there, my mind began to run through possibilities. What if someone had been living here? What if they were still here, just out of sight? I could have sworn I heard something behind me, a snap of a twig, a rustling sound. But when I turned, there was nothing. I kept moving, trying to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The trail continued, but it was harder to follow now. The trees grew thicker, their branches intertwining, casting the forest floor in deep shadow. The silence was suffocating, and I found myself checking over my shoulder more often than usual. And then the feeling intensified. I wasn't just being paranoid anymore. Someone was out here. I could feel it. The air seemed heavier, and the stillness around me made every sound feel amplified. Every footstep on the soft earth echoed in my ears. I picked up my pace, trying to shake the anxiety that was creeping up my spine. I wasn't sure where I was headed anymore, or how far I'd gone. The trail had become less distinct, overgrown in places. My phone, which I had kept in my pack, was out of range, and I realized I hadn't seen a sign or marker in a while. I should have turned back when I had the chance, but I didn't. I kept walking, hoping to find something familiar. It wasn't until I saw the first sign that I realized just how deep into the woods I had ventured. A small, tattered sign nailed to a tree, a trail marker, barely visible. It indicated I was several miles off the main trail, too far to turn around now without retracing my steps for hours. I stood still, listening. Nothing, not a sound. My breath caught in my throat as I realized how isolated I was. If something happened, no one would find me out here. There wasn't even a road within miles. It was just me, the woods, and whatever else was out here with me. I knew I had to keep moving, but now the uncertainty was overwhelming. My senses were on high alert, every snap of a twig or rustle in the leaves sending me into a cold sweat. I decided to head back the way I came, but as I turned, I froze. A figure appeared in the distance, standing between two trees. It was hard to make out at first, but then I could see the shape clearly. A man, tall and thin, standing still, his face obscured by the shadows. I couldn't tell if he was staring at me or just standing there, but the sight sent a shiver down my spine. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. Was he lost? Was he part of the strange shelter I'd seen earlier? I couldn't be sure, but something about his stillness was unnerving. Slowly, I began to back away, moving as quietly as I could. I didn't look back, not once. Eventually, I found the trail again, but the eerie feeling stayed with me. The man, the shelter, the unnatural silence. It all felt like a warning. When I finally made it back to my car, I didn't waste time. I drove back to my cabin as fast as I could, the strange encounter weighing heavily on my mind. That night, as I sat by the fire, I tried to shake off the feeling of being watched, but I couldn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Maybe it was the strange shelter, maybe it was the figure I had seen in the woods. Or maybe I thought as I stared into the fire, I had just been too far out there alone for too long. Whatever it was, I wouldn't be going back to that trail. Not anytime soon. The sun was still high in the sky when I began the hike. It was one of those late summer days where the heat clung to the air, heavy and thick, but the breeze kept things from feeling unbearable. I wasn't exactly new to hiking, but I wasn't an expert either. I had been on enough trails to understand the basics. Stay on the path, keep your gear light, drink water, and don't stray too far from the main trail, especially when you're alone. I was about 2 hours in when I decided to leave the main path. The idea had come to me suddenly, like a pull on the back of my mind. There was a smaller trail veering off to the right, not marked on my map, but clearly visible through the underbrush. It looked untouched, like no one had walked it in a long time. I should have known better, but something about it was enticing. Maybe it was the promise of solitude, or maybe I thought I could find something interesting, something hidden away. So, I stepped off the trail, careful at first but soon more confident as I moved deeper into the woods. The trees were thicker here, their trunks gnarled and twisted, with branches that almost seemed to reach down and grab at me. It was quieter, too. No sounds of other hikers, no distant chatter, just the occasional rustling of leaves or the distant call of a bird. I didn't mind the silence. In fact, I enjoyed it. It was peaceful in a way that only nature could be. But then, as I kept walking, I noticed the landscape changing. The ground was softer here, and the trail grew steeper. I started climbing, my boots sinking into the earth, finding it harder to maintain my balance. The air felt cooler too, less stifling, but it was also more damp, like I was nearing some kind of hidden valley or low-lying swamp. I didn't stop, though. There was something intriguing about the way the trail curved, as though it had a destination, something hidden from view. Eventually, I came to a clearing, and I realized I was standing at the edge of a small cliff, looking down at what could only be described as an overgrown canyon. A narrow creek ran through it, the water fast and frothy as it cut through the rock. The place was eerily quiet, and the air felt even cooler now. I pulled out my map to get my bearings. I was far off the marked trail, but I didn't think it would be a problem. I had seen a few isolated campsites along the way, so I knew I wasn't entirely alone. But as I looked around, I felt a twinge of unease. The canyon, though beautiful, felt strange, almost as if it had been forgotten by time. I decided to follow the creek downstream, thinking that maybe there would be a way to cross to the other side and circle back toward the main trail. But the further I went, the more I noticed something odd. There were signs of human activity. At first, it was small things, broken branches, footprints in the dirt that looked fresh, but not recent enough to be from today. I dismissed them as nothing more than animal tracks. But then I saw something else. A faded piece of cloth caught on a branch. It was a dark green, torn at the edges, like it had been hanging there for a long time. I stopped and stared at it for a moment, my heart rate picking up. The cloth was clearly old, but it seemed too deliberate to be just a random piece of trash. I tugged it free and stuffed it in my bag, wondering who would have left it behind. I had heard stories of people getting lost in the woods, but this felt different. Something about the cloth bothered me. I kept moving, but now my senses were sharper. I scanned the trees more carefully, noticing the way the shadows seemed to shift as the sun began its descent. There were no animals around, no sounds of birds or rustling leaves. The only noise now was the rush of the creek, the wind through the trees, and the steady crunch of my boots on the trail. The deeper I went, the more isolated I felt. The quiet was unsettling, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't the only one in the woods anymore. It wasn't until I reached a rocky outcrop near the creek that I noticed something else. Marks on the rocks. At first, I thought they were just scratches from the weather, but the more I looked, the more it became clear they weren't natural. The lines were too straight, too intentional. It looked like someone had carved into the stone, but the markings were so faded I couldn't make out what they were. They could have been symbols or names, but they were too worn down to decipher. I stepped closer to examine them, but just as I was about to kneel down, I heard something, an unmistakable sound, a branch snapping behind me. I froze. I wasn't alone. I stood completely still, my eyes darting to the trees, but there was no movement, no sign of anyone, just the wind blowing through the branches, the creek running steadily beneath me. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. Maybe it was just an animal, a deer or a raccoon, but deep down, I knew that wasn't it. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I slowly turned around, scanning the trees, looking for any sign of life. My mind raced, thinking of what could be lurking in these woods. I was about to turn back when I heard it again. A soft rustling sound, like something moving through the underbrush, not far from where I stood. Without thinking, I started walking back, retracing my steps toward the main trail. But I didn't dare turn around to see if anyone was following me. Every crack of a twig, every shift in the leaves felt like someone was just behind me, watching me. The light was fading, and I knew I had to hurry. I was far from the main trail now, and the last thing I wanted was to be caught in the woods after dark. I started walking faster, but the sound of rustling got closer. My pace quickened, but so did the noise. I broke into a run. The ground was uneven, and I stumbled a few times, but I couldn't afford to slow down. I had no idea who or what was behind me, but I knew I had to get out of the woods back to safety. I was just about to reach the clearing where I had first noticed the canyon when I heard a shout. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to freeze me in my tracks. My blood ran cold. I turned, but I saw nothing. No one. Nothing but the trees, the shadows stretching long across the ground. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything went silent again. The rustling, the sounds of footsteps, even the wind, it all stopped. The forest was quiet, unnaturally so. I didn't wait to question it. I turned and bolted, not stopping until I reached the main trail. Once I was back on familiar ground, my pace slowed, but my heart was still racing. I had no idea what had just happened, but I didn't stick around to find out. As the sun dipped below the horizon and I reached the parking lot where my car was, I felt a sense of relief. I didn't even care about the cloth or the strange markings I'd found. All that mattered now was that I was out of the woods. And then I heard it, the unmistakable snap of a twig from deep within the trees. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was someone still out there. But I was safe, for now. I had always been the type to enjoy solitude. A backpack, a map, and a few supplies were all I needed to feel free. It was the middle of September, the weather still warm enough for a good hike, but with the chill of autumn beginning to creep into the air as the sun began to dip lower in the sky. I had picked a trail I had never been on before, a moderately challenging path in the mountains about 2 hours from where I lived. There were no big crowds in this part of the park, and the quiet, untouched woods were what I craved. The first few hours went smoothly. The dirt trail was packed tight underfoot, and the trees formed a protective canopy above, filtering the sunlight into a soft, green glow. The sound of birds and the rustle of wind through the branches was the only noise, the perfect soundtrack for a peaceful hike. I had no set destination. My goal was simply to explore, get away from everything for a while, and enjoy the calm. I moved at a steady pace, stopping every so often to take a drink of water or snap a photo of a particularly beautiful view. The trail wound its way up the side of the mountain, getting steeper with each mile. The air was thinner here, and I could feel my lungs working harder as I climbed higher. By mid-afternoon, I had reached a clearing with a view of the valley below. The sun was still high in the sky, casting long shadows across the land. I stood there for a moment, taking it all in, the vast expanse of green forest stretching out below me. It was peaceful, the kind of scene that made all the troubles of the world seem far away. I decided to keep going, knowing I had a couple more hours before I'd need to think about heading back. The trail narrowed and became more rugged, the path less traveled. The dirt was loose in places, and the rocks were slippery. I had to pay closer attention to where I stepped, but I was still in good spirits. After all, a little challenge was what made hiking exciting. As the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows on the forest floor. The trail seemed to grow quieter. I hadn't passed anyone for a while, and the silence was almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of a tree in the breeze or the sound of my own footsteps. There was something eerie about the quiet that started to get under my skin, but I shook it off. It was probably just the isolation. That's when I noticed it. It was faint at first, a sound coming from deeper in the woods. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the wind, maybe an animal scurrying through the brush. But then it came again, a low, guttural noise, almost like a grunt. My heart rate picked up, and I instinctively stopped in my tracks, holding my breath. The noise came again. This time it was louder, closer. It didn't sound like anything I could recognize. It didn't have the rhythm of a deer or the chatter of a squirrel. It was too heavy, too unnatural. I scanned the trees around me, trying to make out anything moving in the shadows. There was nothing. No rustling leaves, no footprints in the dirt. Still, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I took another cautious step forward, then another. The noise had stopped, but the silence that followed felt heavier now, as if something was watching me. I gripped my water bottle tighter and continued down the trail, my eyes darting back and forth between the trees. Another hour passed, and I was beginning to wonder if I was just imagining things. Maybe I had heard an animal, a bear perhaps, or a boar. It wasn't unusual for wild animals to roam these parts, but the strange feeling lingered, that sense that something wasn't right. By the time the trail turned back down the mountain, the sun was almost gone, replaced by the dusky twilight of evening. I should have started heading back sooner, but I had kept pushing forward, thinking I had more time. Now, the thought of being out here after dark sent a chill down my spine. I took out my phone to check the map, but there was no signal. I should have known better than to rely on my phone out here. The trail wasn't marked well, and I had already missed a few turns. My heart sank as I realized I might have gone off track. It didn't help that the sun was setting faster than I expected. The deepening shadows seemed to swallow up the trail in front of me. The trees were closing in, and the path had become overgrown with brambles and thick underbrush. I hadn't expected this part of the hike to be so tricky. Then, just as I was starting to feel truly uneasy, I saw something in the distance. At first, I thought it was a trick of the fading light, but as I squinted, trying to make sense of the shape, I realized it was a person, a figure standing perfectly still in the middle of the trail. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. For a long moment, I just stood there, unsure what to do. My instincts screamed at me to turn around and leave, but there was no way I could go back the way I came. I had no idea how far off track I had gotten, and the trail behind me was just as dark. I took a tentative step forward, hoping to get a better look. The figure remained still. It was hard to tell in the fading light, but the person looked like they were wearing a large coat. But something was off. They didn't seem to belong here, out in the middle of nowhere, standing like that. Another step. The figure moved. I nearly jumped out of my skin, but it wasn't a fast movement, just a subtle turn of the head, as if they were acknowledging my presence. My blood ran cold. I called out. My voice came out weaker than I had intended, like a croak. "Hello?" I asked, but there was no response. The figure didn't even flinch. I wasn't sure what to do. Should I approach them? Turn and run? My brain was a mess of conflicting thoughts. My body was frozen, a wave of cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. Then, to my horror, I realized what was wrong. The person wasn't standing still anymore. They were walking slowly, purposefully, toward me. I took a step back, then another. The figure didn't seem to hurry, but it was coming closer, moving with a slow, deliberate pace. It was as though they had been waiting for me, watching me all along. Every instinct told me to run, but I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were made of lead. The figure was so close now that I could see more details. They weren't wearing a coat, but something dark and tattered. Their face was hidden under a hood, but I could see the glint of something sharp in their hand, maybe a knife or a tool of some kind. In a burst of adrenaline, I finally turned and ran. My heart pounded in my chest as my feet slammed against the uneven ground. I didn't know where I was going, just away from that figure, away from the creeping dread that followed me. Branches scraped against my arms and face, but I didn't care. I pushed forward, every muscle in my body screaming, every step a desperate attempt to outrun whatever was behind me. I kept running until I tripped over a root and tumbled forward, landing hard on the ground. My hands scraped against the dirt, but I didn't stop. I scrambled to my feet, still hearing the sound of footsteps behind me. Closer now. I didn't know how much time had passed, but I finally reached the edge of the trail, barren rocks and cliffs on one side, a steep drop down the mountain on the other. My stomach churned, and for a second, I thought I might fall, but then I heard it, the sound of the figure finally stopping. I wasn't sure if they had given up or if they were waiting, but I didn't dare turn around. My heart was racing, and the air felt thick in my lungs, but I couldn't afford to stop. The shadows were closing in, and the night felt like it was swallowing me whole. But just when I thought I couldn't run any longer, I heard something else. A voice, distant and faint, calling out my name. And in that moment, I realized that the person who had been following me wasn't what I thought at all. It was my friend, Tom, who had been trying to find me. He had been worried when I hadn't checked in, and now I understood why he was calling. I had gotten so lost in the fear of the unknown that I hadn't realized how much time had passed. Tom finally reached me, and I collapsed, exhausted and shaken. He had been following the trail, calling my name, trying to find me. There was no figure, no danger. The trail had gotten darker than I had realized, but I made it out safe. I made a vow to myself right then. Never again would I ignore the signs and push further than I should. It was a reminder that sometimes the fear of the unknown is all in our heads. And sometimes, even when we feel completely alone, help is closer than we think. I decided to take the hike alone, something I hadn't done in a long time. There was a certain calmness I enjoyed when I was by myself in the woods, away from the distractions of the world. The trail I chose was fairly remote, winding through thick pines and up a series of steep ridges. It was the kind of trail that didn't attract many people. I liked that. The solitude, the quiet was exactly what I needed. The day started out clear, crisp, with the faintest scent of pine in the air. I checked my gear once again, making sure my backpack was securely fastened and my water bottle was filled. The sun hadn't yet hit its peak, but the air was already warming. I could hear the soft crunch of my boots on the dirt path beneath me as I started the hike, the trees whispering in the light breeze. I felt the familiar excitement that always came with being in nature, a sense of freedom. The first part of the hike was relatively easy. The trail was wide enough to feel comfortable with only a few small inclines. I passed through groves of tall pines, the ground covered with a soft layer of needles. I could hear the faint chatter of birds in the trees and the occasional rustle of small creatures darting through the underbrush. It wasn't long before the trail began to narrow, twisting into a more rugged path, where I had to step carefully to avoid rocks and roots that had sprouted up along the way. It felt good to be moving, the physical exertion grounding me. The further I went, the more isolated I felt. By the time I reached the first significant rise, the path was steeper, and the trees seemed to close in around me. I paused at the top to catch my breath, wiping a bead of sweat from my forehead. The view stretched out before me. Rolling hills, valleys dotted with patches of trees, and the distant sound of a creek somewhere below. It was peaceful. I pressed on, knowing I was only a few miles into the hike, with many more ahead of me. The higher I climbed, the more challenging the terrain became. The path was marked with faded trail markers, but they weren't as frequent now, and the trail had become harder to follow. The dense forest had given way to an area where large rocks jutted out of the ground, and the trees were smaller, scattered apart. The air was cooler now, and the silence had deepened. It was the kind of quiet that you could feel in your bones, the kind where even the birds and insects seemed to have gone silent. I took a long drink from my water bottle, feeling a slight unease creep in. The trail had become more isolated, and I hadn't seen anyone for hours. My mind wandered, thinking of the map I had glanced at earlier. I knew where I was, more or less, but the thought of how far away the nearest trailhead was made me realize just how alone I was. I continued, pushing through the rising feeling of discomfort. It was nothing unusual, just the creeping sense of isolation that comes with being deep in the woods. The sun was sinking lower, casting long shadows across the trail. The changing light made the forest look different, less inviting, more mysterious. The shadows seemed deeper now, and I started to notice how much the wind had picked up, rustling the branches overhead, sending little bursts of dry leaves and pine needles skittering across the path. The next part of the trail was far steeper, and I had to focus all my attention on footing, grabbing onto tree roots and rocks as I climbed. Sweat dripped down my back as I worked my way up. The feeling of exhaustion began to weigh on me. My legs were starting to burn from the climb, and I hadn't seen a signpost for what felt like a while. At the top of the ridge, I stopped to catch my breath again, looking out across the valley below. My stomach rumbled, reminding me that I hadn't eaten anything since breakfast. I pulled out a granola bar and ate slowly, enjoying the small break. The sun was lower now, just about to dip below the horizon, and the temperature had dropped considerably. The shadows in the trees were growing longer, and I realized that if I didn't find a place to camp soon, I would be walking in the dark. I glanced at my map again. There was a small clearing ahead, just beyond a thicket of trees, and I figured it would be a good place to set up for the night. I packed away the empty granola bar wrapper and started down the trail again, the rocks beneath my feet now slick from the evening dew. I had to move carefully, watching my steps, until I reached the thicket. It was more overgrown than I expected, and the dense brush made it difficult to see the path clearly. Still, I pushed through, hoping the clearing was just a bit further. I made it through the thicket, and there it was, a small, open space with a few scattered rocks and a patch of grass that looked dry enough for me to set up my tent. The sky was almost dark now, and the temperature had dropped sharply. I took off my pack and started setting up camp. The tent went up quickly, and I was grateful for that. I didn't want to be out here much longer in the cold. Once my tent was up, I gathered a few dry branches from the surrounding area and made a small fire. The flames flickered to life, casting warmth and light against the encroaching night. I sat down by the fire, feeling the heat on my skin. It was quiet here, so still that the crackling of the fire seemed louder than it should have been. The night air grew colder, and I wrapped myself in my jacket, watching the flames. The firelight danced in the darkness, making the trees around me seem even more distant, more ominous. I told myself it was just the fatigue setting in, that I was being paranoid. The stillness of the forest, the fact that I hadn't seen anyone else for hours, was starting to make me uneasy. The fire crackled loudly, almost as if it were trying to fill the silence. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling sound, coming from the direction of the thicket I had passed through earlier. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a squirrel or a raccoon, but the sound grew louder. It wasn't the random scurrying of a small creature. This was heavier, more deliberate. The rustling came closer, moving through the underbrush, and I froze. My hand instinctively reached for the knife I had clipped to my belt, and I couldn't help but glance around, trying to see where the noise was coming from. It was too dark to see anything clearly, but I could feel the tension rising in the air, like something was watching me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and the unease that had been growing inside me reached its peak. I tried to convince myself that it was just an animal, that I was overreacting. But the noise persisted, getting closer. I slowly stood up, the fire crackling louder in the silence, and I moved to the edge of the clearing. My eyes strained to see beyond the reach of the firelight, but all I could make out were the black silhouettes of trees and the thick underbrush. I listened harder, trying to pinpoint the direction of the noise. It was close, but not close enough to make out any shape or form. It was too dark for that. Another rustle, louder now. Something heavy was moving through the underbrush. I gripped the knife tighter, my heart pounding in my chest. I thought about the path I had taken, the way out. It would be a steep descent, and it would be difficult to navigate in the dark. I didn't know if I'd be able to make it down safely in time if whatever was out there decided to move closer. I wasn't alone. The realization hit me like a punch to the stomach. someone or something was out there. The noise was too consistent to be random. There was no wind rustling the branches. This was something moving. The air felt colder still, and I stood there, frozen, listening for any sound that might give me more of a clue. Then it stopped. The rustling ceased completely. I strained my ears, trying to hear any sound, but there was nothing. For a moment, everything was perfectly still. My breath felt too loud in my chest, my heart hammering against my ribs. I thought about grabbing my pack and leaving, running down the trail without looking back, but my legs were stiff with fear, and I wasn't sure if I could make it out of there safely if I ran. It was then that I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from behind me. It was like the figure was moving through the clearing, just on the edge of the light, staying just out of sight. The footsteps didn't sound rushed. They didn't sound like someone who was trying to escape. It was as if they were waiting for something or someone. I spun around quickly, adrenaline surging, knife raised, but there was no one there. Nothing but the shadows of the trees stretching long into the night. The feeling of being watched didn't leave me. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, not bothering to extinguish the fire. My senses were on high alert, every noise amplified in the night. As I walked away from the camp, I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something following me. But the trail was empty, the night as silent as ever. The more I walked, the more the fear faded, but the feeling of unease lingered. Eventually, I reached the end of the trail, where it merged with a more heavily trafficked path. I wasn't sure what had been out there, but I knew I wasn't going to be going back. Not alone, not in the dark. I didn't have any answers, but I did have one thing, a lesson. Never let my guard down in the wild. You never know who or what might be watching. I never considered myself an expert hiker. I'd done a few weekend trips, the kind where you end up at a nice cabin or a spot that's more or less populated by other hikers. But this time, I wanted to go solo to really immerse myself in the wild. It was a last-minute decision, a weekend free of obligations, and I found a trail that seemed perfect, just challenging enough to test me but not too far off the beaten path. I packed my gear the night before: lightweight tent, sleeping bag, some food, and plenty of water. My boots were broken in, though not as much as I would have liked. I also brought a small first aid kit, a flashlight, and a map, though I wasn't sure how much use the map would be. The area was known for its dense forests and meandering trails. No one had mentioned anything particularly dangerous about it, but as I studied the route, I realized I didn't know exactly how long the trail was. It was marked as a moderate route, but moderate is subjective when it comes to hiking. I set off early, the first light of dawn creeping over the horizon. The air was crisp, the kind of chill that makes you grateful for a warm jacket. As I moved deeper into the woods, the trail narrowed, the trees grew thicker, and I felt the weight of isolation settling in. It was quiet, no birds, no squirrels scurrying about, just the sound of my footsteps crunching on the dirt path. For the first few hours, the hike went smoothly. The trail was fairly straightforward, winding through a mixed forest of pines and broadleaf trees. Occasionally, the trees parted, offering views of distant mountains, their jagged peaks looming against the pale sky. I could feel the burn in my legs as I ascended, but it wasn't too bad. The silence of the forest wrapped around me, the solitude both peaceful and slightly unnerving. Around midday, I came to a fork in the trail. One path led to a high ridge with an overlook, while the other descended into a valley. The map didn't give much detail about either direction, just vague symbols and shaded areas. I'd intended to go the ridge route, but for some reason I was drawn to the valley trail. Maybe I thought it would be quieter, more secluded. I had no real reason for the change, just a feeling that I wanted to explore further into the heart of the forest. I followed the valley trail for another hour. The forest grew denser, and the sunlight barely made it through the thick canopy overhead. The ground became softer, more uneven. I had to watch my step to avoid tripping over roots or slipping on rocks hidden under the fallen leaves. The air was thick with moisture, and I could feel the dampness seeping into my clothes, though the temperature was still cool enough that it didn't bother me. As the afternoon wore on, I realized the trail had become less and less defined. It wasn't that I'd lost it entirely. There were still marks on the trees and a faint indentation in the dirt, but the path was growing more overgrown. The branches of trees reached out, brushing against my face, and thick vines tangled with my boots, making progress slower. I checked my watch. 3 o'clock. I'd been on this trail longer than I'd planned, and I wasn't sure how much farther I had to go. The map didn't seem to help much anymore. The symbols were vague, and there were no clear landmarks. I paused for a moment to check my bearings, trying to get a sense of where I was. The map indicated a stream up ahead, but it wasn't clear whether I'd passed it already or if I was still a ways off. I glanced around, feeling a slight twinge of unease. The forest was quiet again. No animals, no sounds of life except for the wind in the trees. I shook it off, told myself I was just being paranoid. This was just a quiet part of the woods, that's all. I pressed on, the trail becoming more difficult. Now I had to scramble over fallen trees and boulders. My legs were starting to feel the strain, and I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail for hours. That should have been comforting. More solitude, no distractions. But for some reason, it made me feel more isolated, as if I was far away from any sign of civilization. I stopped again to check the map, only to realize that the trail wasn't matching up with what I'd expected. The markings didn't make sense. The stream that should have been ahead wasn't where it was supposed to be, and I couldn't find any recognizable landmarks. A knot formed in my stomach. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, and the light was fading fast. I had no intention of getting lost in these woods, especially when the trail was getting so difficult to follow. I checked my map once more, my frustration growing. Maybe it was the fatigue, or maybe it was just the unsettling quiet, but I began to feel like something was wrong. I couldn't explain it, just a sense of being off track, like the forest was closing in around me. I turned around and started retracing my steps, but the more I walked, the more the trail seemed to shift. The landmarks I remembered were gone, and I couldn't find any familiar markers on the trees. It felt like the forest had changed in some subtle, almost imperceptible way. The feeling of unease grew stronger, gnawing at me with every step. As darkness began to fall, I realized that I was completely lost. I tried to backtrack, but the woods all looked the same, and the faint trail I had been following had completely disappeared. Panic crept in. I knew I needed to find shelter before it got dark. Too many stories of people getting lost in the wilderness, only to succumb to exposure. I forced myself to calm down, focusing on my breath as I scanned the trees. There had to be something, anything, that would tell me where I was. I spotted a clearing up ahead and made my way toward it, hoping for some sign of a camp or trail marker. But when I reached the clearing, I realized that the ground was too uneven to camp on. The earth was damp and uneven, and there was no shelter to be found. I knew I couldn't stay out in the open for long. The cold would set in soon, and I'd be in trouble if I didn't find a place to camp for the night. I pushed deeper into the forest, walking for what felt like hours. The exhaustion was starting to weigh heavily on me, but I couldn't stop. I needed to find shelter, something, anything that would help me survive the night. Finally, as the light from the setting sun began to fade, I spotted a small cave tucked into the base of a large rock formation. It wasn't much, just a shallow overhang, but it was better than nothing. I crawled inside, setting up my tent as best as I could. I used my flashlight to get a better look at the area around me, but all I could see was darkness beyond the beam of light. The night was cold, and the wind picked up, howling through the trees. My stomach growled, reminding me that I hadn't eaten much during the day. I had some snacks, but they wouldn't keep me full for long. Still, I managed to eat a granola bar and sip some water before I settled into my tent, trying to get some rest. I tried to stay calm, reminding myself that I could figure this out in the morning. But sleep was hard to come by. Every rustling sound outside the tent made my heart race. My mind raced with thoughts of being lost, of spending another night in these woods with no real way out. In the dead of night, I woke up to a sound, a crack. It wasn't a branch snapping in the wind, not the usual rustle of leaves. This was something else. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. I listened intently, holding my breath, trying to make out the sound. Another crack, then another. It was coming from somewhere near the cave entrance. I grabbed my flashlight, shining it toward the noise. The beam flickered weakly at first, but then it illuminated a shadow near the entrance of the cave. I froze. My mind raced, but there was no clear explanation. My flashlight flickered again, casting shadows over the entrance, but nothing appeared. The silence returned, thick and heavy. I didn't know if it was an animal, or if I was just too tired, too paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. When morning finally came, I packed up quickly, desperate to leave the cave behind. I was exhausted, mentally and physically drained, but the thought of staying another night in that forest terrified me. I retraced my steps again, trying to find the path I had originally taken. Hours passed, and I stumbled across a familiar marker, a scratched tree. A sense of relief flooded me, and I followed the trail, making sure to pay attention to every turn and every landmark this time. By late afternoon, I found my way back to the main trail, and the feeling of safety washed over me as I finally saw the parking lot in the distance. The moment I stepped out of the woods and back into the open, I felt the weight lift from my shoulders. I wasn't lost anymore. As I drove home, I couldn't shake the sense of unease. The woods had been so quiet, so still, and the isolation had played tricks on my mind. I was lucky to have found my way back, lucky to have made it out alive. The experience had taught me one thing. No matter how prepared you think you are, nature can still catch you off guard. And sometimes, just being able to find your way out of a situation like that is the best thing you can hope for. I had been planning this hiking trip for months. A long weekend alone in the mountains was just what I needed to get away from everything. The noise of the city, the constant stream of people, the digital buzz of life. It was just me, my backpack, and a clear path up the mountain. I had studied the trail maps extensively, even watched a few YouTube videos of hikers who had done it before. It was a well-known route, but it was a good bit out of the way, which meant not too many people hiked it. It was exactly what I wanted. Solitude. I set off early, the sun just beginning to rise, casting a soft golden glow over the trees. The air was crisp, cool enough to make me zip up my jacket, but still fresh in that way only mornings in the mountains could be. I was feeling good. My pack was light food, water, a map, a flashlight, and a few other essentials. Nothing too heavy, nothing too complicated. The path started easy enough, winding gently through thick pines and dense underbrush. Birds chirped overhead, their songs echoing through the quiet woods. I breathed it all in, the fresh pine scent, the earthy smell of damp soil. The only sound, aside from my footsteps, was the occasional rustle of leaves. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, but that was why I came. I had decided to tackle the trail by myself because, for once, I wanted the solitude. No distractions, no one else's pace to keep up with, no one to talk to. Just me and the wilderness. The trail was well marked at first, easy to follow, with the occasional signpost telling me I was on the right track. I had no particular destination other than to keep hiking until I felt like stopping. The higher I climbed, the more the trees opened up. The forest began to thin, and soon I was on a rocky ridge that offered stunning views of the valley below. I could see for miles. The mountains stretched out in front of me like some endless sea of ridgelines and distant peaks. I stopped for a while to take it all in. No one else was around, and that gave me a strange sense of satisfaction. This was my moment of solitude, just as I had imagined. But the further I went, the more isolated it felt. The path started to get less well-defined. I could still make out the trail, but it was a lot narrower, a lot more overgrown. The rocks underfoot were uneven, and I had to watch my step as I navigated around them. At one point, I lost the trail entirely. I stepped off it for just a moment to stretch my legs and check my map, and when I looked up, the trail had disappeared into a mess of thick brush and tangled roots. For a moment, I stood there, trying to decide whether I should backtrack or try to find the path again. I didn't want to lose time. My watch said it was only noon, still plenty of daylight left. I pulled out my compass, checked the map again, and decided to push forward. The mountain had a way of changing suddenly. What seemed like a perfectly clear trail could turn into a dead end in no time. But I'd come this far, and I wasn't about to turn back just yet. I pushed through the brush, making my way toward what looked like an opening up ahead. It was getting steeper. The air felt thinner, and my legs were starting to burn a little. The sun was higher now, the warmth on my back was a comfort, but the trail was beginning to take its toll on me. I kept moving, my breathing shallow, my focus on the next step. But then I heard something, a soft rustling, like something or someone was moving through the brush. It made me freeze. My heart started to race as I scanned the area around me. Nothing, just the sound of the wind through the trees. Probably a deer, I told myself, or maybe a squirrel, but something about it still felt off. I didn't stop, but I kept listening. My steps became quieter. I knew I was being cautious, but there was a nagging feeling that I couldn't shake. I continued moving, trying not to get distracted by that strange, unsettling feeling. As I passed a large boulder, I looked up again, and there it was, a figure standing at the edge of the trees. I stopped dead in my tracks. It was a man, but his posture was odd. His shoulders slumped like he was in pain or worse, exhausted. He didn't seem to notice me right away, just standing there with his back to me, his face partially hidden by the trees. My first instinct was to call out to him, to ask if he needed help, but then I remembered where I was. I was miles away from civilization. Anyone out here had to know what they were doing. Still, something about the scene felt wrong. He seemed out of place. I wasn't sure why, but I backed off a few steps, moving quietly. I watched him for a while, waiting to see if he'd turn around or make any movement. After what felt like a minute, he finally turned, slowly, his eyes locking onto mine. There was no expression on his face, no smile, no look of surprise, just a vacant stare. It was unsettling. I turned and started walking faster, keeping an eye on him. My instincts were telling me to get away, but my curiosity was still gnawing at me. What was he doing out here? Had he been following me? There were so many questions, and yet, I didn't want any answers. I didn't look back again as I quickened my pace, but the crunch of leaves underfoot and the thump of my heartbeat made it hard to focus. The feeling of being watched never left me, and even though the trail ahead seemed clear, every rustle in the trees made me flinch. I kept moving forward, hoping I was just being paranoid, hoping it was nothing. The woods were starting to feel too quiet, too empty. Then I heard it, a sharp snap like a twig breaking, too loud. I froze. My breath caught in my throat as I turned to glance behind me. The man was gone, just like that. No trace of him, no rustling, no sound. He had vanished into the trees. The air felt thick. The silence pressed in on me. I stood there for what felt like forever, my mind racing with all the possibilities. Maybe I was just being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I couldn't afford to stay here any longer. I had been looking forward to this solo hiking trip for weeks. The mountains were calling me, and I felt ready for a peaceful journey in the woods, away from the noise of the city and all the distractions that filled up my daily life. It was just going to be me, my gear, and the trail. I had planned to spend a couple of days hiking through a relatively remote part of the national park. It wasn't a famous trail. No busy tour groups or marked signs everywhere. Just a stretch of land I had researched online, known for its natural beauty and seclusion. The kind of place where you could find peace, away from civilization. The trail wasn't even particularly difficult, from what I could tell. Some elevation, some rocky paths, and occasional creek crossings. All the things I loved. I packed light but brought all the necessary equipment. A sturdy tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and a few other essentials like a first aid kit, flashlight, and a map of the trail. I wasn't expecting anything unusual, just the usual routine. Wake up early, hike through the day, set up camp, and enjoy the stillness of nature. Simple. The first day went smoothly enough. I started early in the morning, just as the first light of day hit the forest floor. The air was cool, fresh with the scent of pine and wet soil. The trail was narrow, winding through trees, and occasionally opening up to wide views of the valley below. It was quiet, the kind of silence you only get in nature. The sounds of birds and wind through the leaves were the only things filling the air. I moved steadily, taking in the beauty of the forest around me. There was something calming about the rhythm of my steps. One foot in front of the other, nothing to worry about except where the next step would land. By mid-afternoon, I had reached a nice spot to rest. I sat on a large rock by a creek, letting the cool water wash over my tired legs. I didn't have any real plans for the day other than to hike to the next camp spot, which was still several miles ahead. But something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe it was the stillness of the forest, or how the birds seemed to have quieted down. It wasn't an alarming feeling, just a vague sense of unease, like when you're certain someone is watching you, even if you can't see them. I shook it off. It was probably nothing. Maybe I was just overthinking things. I continued on, walking deeper into the woods, my pace slower now as the trail became a bit more rugged. The rocks grew larger, the ground more uneven, but I had been prepared for this. I wasn't concerned about the difficulty of the hike. But then, as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, I noticed something strange. There were more and more fallen branches on the trail, branches that hadn't been there earlier. They weren't huge, just small, broken bits of wood, scattered like someone had tossed them along the way. It wasn't a natural pattern, though. These weren't just regular branches. Some of them had been snapped, not fallen naturally. I paused, looking around. I had read about wildlife in this part of the park: deer, elk, and occasionally the odd bear or mountain lion. But this wasn't the usual disturbance I would expect from animals. Something about the arrangement of the branches seemed deliberate. A knot began to form in my stomach, but I didn't want to panic. I wasn't new to the outdoors. I had hiked alone before, and I knew that if you let fear control you, you'd make mistakes. So I pushed the thought aside and pressed on. The next stretch of the trail became more challenging as the terrain got steeper. The sun had dipped behind the trees now, and the forest was growing darker. I had a flashlight in my pack, but I didn't want to stop just yet to get it out. That's when I heard it. A snap. The unmistakable sound of a branch breaking, somewhere off to my right. It wasn't the wind or the rustling of leaves. It was the sound of something heavier, something larger moving through the underbrush. My heart skipped a beat, and for the first time all day, I felt a jolt of real fear. I stopped dead in my tracks, trying to listen over the sound of my own heartbeat. The forest was quiet again. Too quiet. No birds, no wind, nothing. I took a slow breath, forcing myself not to panic. Could have been a deer, or maybe a tree branch just falling. But why did it feel like something was stalking me, watching me from the shadows? I glanced around, the weight of the silence pressing down on me. But nothing, just trees and darkening woods. I started walking again, faster now, trying to put distance between myself and whatever had made that noise. But then, it happened again. This time, the snap was louder, closer. My pulse raced. I had no idea what was out there, but I knew it wasn't a small animal. Something big, something heavy. I told myself to calm down, to keep moving, but every step I took felt like a mistake. The feeling that I was being watched only grew stronger. And then I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, a figure darted between the trees. Too quick for me to make out any details, but enough for me to see that it wasn't an animal. This was human shape, tall, dark, and moving fast. My body froze. The blood in my veins seemed to turn to ice. I wasn't sure what to do. My mind was racing, thinking through every possible scenario. What if it was a hiker like me? Maybe someone who had gotten lost or was in trouble. Or maybe it was someone else. Someone who shouldn't be out here. But I couldn't just stand there, staring. My instincts kicked in. I started moving again, faster now, desperate to get out of the open. The trail ahead looked like it would open up to a clearing, and I pushed myself toward it. If I could just reach that area, I could make some noise, call out, and let whoever it was know I was there. As I moved, I glanced over my shoulder. No sign of anyone, but the feeling didn't go away. I had almost reached the clearing when I heard it again. A quick movement, a shadow darting between the trees. This time, closer. I wasn't imagining it. Someone or something was out there and they were following me. In a panic, I made a decision. I veered off the trail into the thick underbrush. I knew it would slow me down, but I couldn't just keep going down the path. Whoever it was might be waiting ahead, where the trail opened up. I stumbled through the dense brush, my legs scraping against the thorny plants and branches. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I forced myself to keep moving. I couldn't stop now. Then, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A voice. Low, muffled, like someone was trying to talk without being heard. The sound was just on the edge of my hearing, but it was unmistakable. I held my breath, waiting for the sound to fade. Didn't. The voice was getting closer, and I realized that the person following me wasn't just tracking me. They were closing in. I had to act quickly. I had to get somewhere safe. I pushed harder through the underbrush, making my way toward what I hoped was a ridge that overlooked the valley. If I could get up high, maybe I could spot them from a distance and figure out where they were. But just as I reached the top, I heard a loud crack behind me. I turned around, heart in my throat. A figure, tall, wearing dark clothing, emerged from the trees. The person was moving fast, but not toward me. Instead, they were moving along the same path I had just taken. They seemed to be scanning the ground, their eyes darting back and forth, as if they were looking for something. I held perfectly still, praying that they hadn't seen me. Minutes passed. I wasn't sure if they were gone or if I had just gotten lucky. But either way, I didn't wait around to find out. I stayed hidden on the ridge for what felt like an eternity, watching and listening for any sign of movement. Eventually, I heard nothing. After what seemed like hours, I made my move, carefully and quietly climbing back down toward the trail. I had lost track of time, but I had to get to safety. When I finally made it to the trail, I could see the setting sun beginning to dip below the horizon. The light was fading fast. I had a decision to make. Head back to where I had planned to camp, or find a safer location further away. In the end, I chose to keep moving forward, hoping that the path ahead would lead me to a more populated area of the park. I had no idea if the person who had been following me was still out there, but I wasn't going to take any chances. By the time I reached the next campsite, I was exhausted, both mentally and physically. I set up my tent quickly, still on edge, constantly listening for any sound. The night was long, but I eventually drifted into a restless sleep, knowing I had made it through the worst of it. The next morning, I packed up and left without looking back. I had always enjoyed hiking alone. It was something about the quiet of nature, the solitude, that put my mind at ease. Maybe it was because I had been working too much, or maybe it was because life in general felt too hectic. Whatever the reason, I was out in the woods this weekend, looking for peace and a little bit of adventure. A solo hike in the mountains was exactly what I needed. I parked my car at the trailhead and checked my gear one last time. My backpack was packed with the essentials: a water bottle, snacks, a first aid kit, a small flashlight, and my phone, just in case, though I rarely got service out here. I had planned on doing a loop that would take me up the mountain and then back down by another trail. I'd done this hike before, so I knew it well enough. It wasn't a difficult trail, but it wasn't exactly easy either. It was about a 7-hour round trip, and I'd estimated I'd be back before dark. The first few miles were a breeze. The weather was perfect, crisp air, just warm enough to make the hike comfortable. The trail wound through dense trees, the canopy of leaves creating a patchwork of light and shadow on the forest floor. It was peaceful. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the dirt trail and the occasional chirp of a bird or rustle of leaves. As I moved deeper into the woods, I noticed the trail becoming less defined. It wasn't exactly overgrown, but the path was becoming harder to follow. I had to pay more attention to the ground beneath me to make sure I wasn't veering off track. The farther I went, the more I felt isolated. The trees grew thicker, and the air seemed to cool. It was strange how quickly everything seemed to change. I hadn't expected the forest to feel so distant. Not in a comforting way, but in a way that made me more alert. After a couple of hours, I came to a spot where the trail split. I remembered this junction. The left trail led to a ridge where you could get a stunning view of the valley below. The right trail, the one I'd planned to take, headed straight up the mountain. I was feeling good, still full of energy, so I decided to stick to my plan and keep going up. The climb was steep, and the path was rougher, full of rocks and tree roots. My legs started to feel the strain, but I pushed on, telling myself that the view at the top would be worth it. As I climbed higher, the forest seemed to change again. The trees became sparser, and I could see more of the surrounding landscape. The silence was deeper, almost oppressive. It was one of those moments where you could almost feel the weight of the wilderness around you. The air was thick, and my breath was coming in short bursts as I reached a particularly steep part of the trail. I paused for a moment to catch my breath and pulled out my water bottle. That's when I heard it, a sound in the distance, just on the edge of my hearing. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but it didn't feel right. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate. It sounded like footsteps. My heart skipped a beat. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just an animal, or maybe it was the wind playing tricks on me. But the longer I stood there, the more I realized that I was not alone. I looked around, but I didn't see anything. No sign of anyone on the trail. No movement in the trees. Could have been an animal, maybe a deer or something larger, but it didn't sit right with me. I felt a tightness in my chest, a sudden unease I couldn't explain. I checked my phone, no signal, of course. It wasn't unusual in these mountains, but it still left me feeling vulnerable. I decided to keep moving. Maybe the noise was nothing, or maybe it was a hiker coming up behind me. Either way, I didn't want to be stuck standing still for too long. I started walking again, my pace quickening just a little. The trail became more challenging, but the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. Every sound, every rustle in the trees made me jump. My breath was quick, and my mind kept circling back to the footsteps I thought I had heard. Was it just me, or was someone else on the trail? As I reached a small plateau, I heard the sound again, this time closer. It was unmistakable, a footstep. One, then another, slow and deliberate. My eyes darted across the landscape, trying to spot anything, but I still saw nothing. My stomach turned, and a wave of cold sweat ran down my back. I was being paranoid, I told myself. It was probably nothing, but then I heard it again. Closer. I froze. This wasn't normal. It was too quiet, too deliberate, and if someone was following me, they were moving at a pace that matched mine exactly. Not too fast, not too slow, just enough to keep me on edge. I slowly turned around, scanning the trail behind me. Nothing. I took another few steps forward, my eyes flicking over the terrain around me. Then, just as I was about to push on, I heard the crunch of a twig underfoot from behind. I spun around, my pulse racing. There was no one there. I stood still for what felt like forever, listening. The sound had stopped. I strained my ears, hoping to hear something, anything, that would tell me I wasn't imagining things. But all I heard was the wind and the faint rustle of leaves. My heart was pounding now, my instincts screaming that something was wrong. I started walking faster, not running because I didn't want to panic, but faster than I had been moving before. My eyes kept darting over my shoulder, but there was no sign of anyone, just the empty, quiet forest. But then something snapped, a branch breaking, and I heard it, louder this time, footsteps, clear as day, heavy, deliberate, and right behind me. I whirled around. Nothing. I had reached the ridge now, where the trail flattened out and offered a stunning view. I paused for a moment to catch my breath and steady my nerves. But there was no one there, no one on the trail. It was just me and the mountain. But that feeling lingered, the unmistakable sense that I was being followed, watched. I didn't want to admit it, but I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. Someone or something was out there. The rest of the hike down was a blur. I kept glancing over my shoulder, my senses on high alert. Every shadow in the trees, every rustle of leaves made my heart jump. I don't know if I was just being paranoid, but I had never been so acutely aware of my surroundings in my life. The trail seemed to stretch out forever, the familiar path now feeling alien and dangerous. By the time I reached the bottom, the sun was starting to dip behind the mountains. I was exhausted, drained in a way I hadn't been when I started the hike. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched, still being followed, even as I walked back toward my car. I could see the parking lot in the distance, a few cars parked under the last remnants of daylight. As I reached the trailhead, I stopped for a moment to catch my breath. The silence of the forest around me felt deafening. I stood there, listening, and for a brief moment, I thought I heard something. But it wasn't footsteps this time. It was the sound of a car starting up, the faint hum of an engine coming from the far end of the lot. I turned around quickly, half expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing, just the empty lot and the fading light of day. I didn't stick around. I got in my car, locked the doors, and drove away without looking back. I couldn't explain what had happened that day, but one thing was clear. I wasn't going to hike alone in those mountains again, not without a clear answer to the feeling I had that I wasn't alone out there. And that was the scariest part of it all. I'll never know who or what was following me, but I'd learned that sometimes, even in the quietest of places, things aren't always what they seem. It had been a long week at work, and I needed some time away from everything. I needed peace, quiet, and the kind of solitude that only nature could offer. I decided to take a weekend hiking trip to the mountains, a place I had hiked before but never alone. That was about to change. The hike itself was well known for its challenging terrain, its steep inclines, and its rough paths. But I had prepared for it. I had my gear, my food, a map of the trails, and a strong will to see it through. I was ready for anything that might come my way. At least I thought I was. The sun was setting when I started. The sky, a pale orange, slowly turned to pink, then a deep purple as I climbed higher and higher into the foothills. The familiar sounds of the city faded away, replaced by the quiet of the wilderness. Birds fluttered from tree to tree. The rustling of leaves sounded like whispers, and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot echoed in the stillness. I wasn't in any rush. I planned to camp at the first good spot I found, set up my tent, and enjoy the peace. The first few hours were uneventful, and the sun eventually disappeared behind the mountains, leaving a soft, golden glow lingering on the horizon. I noticed a slight chill in the air, and I zipped up my jacket to keep warm. I had hoped to get to my campsite before it got too dark, but that didn't happen. The trail had become steeper, and I found myself struggling a bit more than I expected. Still, the excitement of the hike pushed me forward. I glanced at the map occasionally, checking that I was still on track. It wasn't long before the sun disappeared completely, and the dark shadows of the trees around me became even more intimidating. The path twisted around rocks and small streams, and the light from my headlamp barely cut through the thickening darkness. My feet slipped a few times, making the hike more challenging than I had planned for. But I didn't want to stop. I was determined to get as far as I could before setting up camp. Around 2 hours after nightfall, I came to a spot that seemed promising. There was a small clearing where the trees opened up enough to give me a view of the star-filled sky. I set down my pack and looked around. The area seemed quiet, maybe a little too quiet. The air felt thicker here, and the stillness made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I decided to set up camp. The ground was uneven, but it would do. As I assembled the tent, I heard a distant sound, a rustling in the trees behind me. My heart skipped a beat. I turned around, but the darkness only revealed a dense forest. No movement, nothing. I shook off the feeling. It was probably an animal, I told myself. Nothing to worry about. I finished setting up my tent, lit a small campfire, and sat down by it. The crackling of the fire was comforting. I pulled out a granola bar and ate slowly, savoring the quiet. The firelight danced on the trees around me, and the world felt small and peaceful in that moment. But the peace didn't last long. A sudden noise, loud and sharp, snapped me out of my thoughts. Came from behind the trees again, closer this time. The rustling was followed by the sound of something heavy moving through the underbrush. I stood up, my heart now racing. There were no large animals around here that I knew of, not in this part of the trail. Was it a bear or something else? I grabbed the nearby flashlight and shone it toward the noise, but the beam didn't cut through the darkness enough to reveal anything. The hairs on my arms stood on end, and I suddenly felt very exposed. The sounds continued, moving around me in circles. It sounded like whatever was out there was getting closer. Too close. I stood frozen, trying to make out the shape of whatever was moving through the trees. The fire crackled loudly, but there was something muffling the sounds of the forest around me, making everything feel more distant. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. This was no ordinary animal noise. It wasn't a deer or a raccoon or a small creature. No, this was something heavier, more deliberate. The sound stopped for a moment, and in the silence, I thought I could hear breathing. It was too slow to be an animal. It wasn't even the kind of breathing you'd expect from a bear or another wild animal. It sounded human. My stomach twisted into a knot. I quickly grabbed my pack and stuffed it inside the tent. If someone was out there, I didn't want to be caught off guard. I was still trying to process what was happening when the noise started again. This time, it was much closer, too close to ignore. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I didn't know which way to go. I could hear footsteps now, and they were coming toward me from behind the trees. I thought about grabbing my phone, but then I realized there was no service here. I was completely alone, isolated, and unprepared for whatever this was. I quickly zipped myself inside the tent and closed the flap tightly, my breath coming faster now. I sat in the dark, holding my breath, hoping that whatever was out there wouldn't hear my racing heartbeat. I stayed still for what felt like hours, listening to the sounds of footsteps, the occasional snap of a twig, the soft rustling of leaves. Then, everything went quiet. For a few moments, I sat there, waiting for some sound, any sound, but there was nothing, not even the usual noises of the night. It was as though the entire forest had stopped breathing. I slowly unzipped the tent flap just enough to peek outside. The fire had died down to nothing but embers, casting a faint glow on the surrounding trees. The rustling was gone. The footsteps had ceased. There was no sign of anyone. I stood up, my knees shaky, and stepped cautiously out of the tent, trying to remain as silent as possible. The darkness was so thick it felt like it was closing in on me. My flashlight shone only a few feet in front of me before it disappeared into the void. I tried to steady my breath, not wanting to make any noise, not wanting to alert whoever might be out there. I walked around the campsite, scanning the area with my flashlight. Nothing. No footprints, no signs of someone having been there. The forest, once filled with rustling sounds, was completely still again. I could feel the tension in the air, but I couldn't explain it. I couldn't explain why I felt like something was watching me. I spent the next few hours awake, constantly looking out into the dark, listening for any movement. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. And it wasn't just the fear of animals or the usual sounds of the wilderness. This was different. It was the feeling of being watched, of being hunted. By morning, the sun had risen, but I still felt uneasy. The forest seemed quieter, more peaceful in the daylight, but the events of the night played over and over in my mind. I packed up quickly, not even bothering to make breakfast, and started the hike back down the trail. The path felt different now, less familiar, more oppressive. The forest was still beautiful, but I couldn't shake the sense that someone or something was following me. The hike back took longer than I remembered. Every snap of a branch underfoot made me jump. Every rustle in the bushes made my heart race. I kept checking over my shoulder, but there was never anything there. Still, the unease lingered. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like the night had changed me, or maybe it was the forest that had changed. Either way, I wasn't staying out there any longer. When I finally made it to the trailhead, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. I could see my car parked at the edge of the parking lot, and as I stepped onto the gravel, I took one last look at the dense woods. There was nothing there, nothing to suggest that anyone had been following me, that anything had happened at all. But I knew what I felt. I knew what I experienced, and I knew I wouldn't be hiking there alone again. I've always loved hiking. The quiet of nature, the feeling of being away from everything, and the satisfaction of reaching the summit. It's been a way for me to get away from life stresses, clear my head, and recharge. This one hike, though, started out just like any other. But by the end of it, I'd learned something about myself and about the wilderness that I never expected. It was a crisp autumn morning when I set out, the kind of morning where the air feels fresh and you can almost taste the change of the seasons. The trees were beginning to turn, patches of red and gold mixing with the last remnants of green. I chose a trail I had hiked a few times before, a moderately difficult route that led to a small, secluded waterfall. It was about a 6-mile hike, one that I knew well enough to feel comfortable but still challenging enough to enjoy. I parked my car at the trailhead and strapped on my boots, adjusted my backpack, and started my hike. The trail was mostly dirt, winding through tall trees that filtered the sunlight into soft beams. There were a few others there, mostly families or casual hikers, but they didn't linger long. After the first mile, the trail narrowed, and I found myself walking alone, the sound of my boots crunching on the path the only noise. The first part of the trail was easy, gentle slopes and flat stretches. It wasn't until I passed the first stream crossing that things started to feel different. The air was getting colder, and the quiet felt deeper. It wasn't the usual silence of the woods. There was something heavy in the air, something that made the birds seem quieter, the wind softer. I paused, taking a deep breath, but the unsettling feeling didn't leave me. I kept walking, trying to shake it off. I've hiked alone plenty of times before, but this time, for some reason, I felt like I wasn't alone. It was as if the forest itself was watching me. The trail began to climb, a series of switchbacks that led up the side of a hill. As I made my way up, the trees thickened around me, and the light dimmed. It was the kind of place where the shadows seemed to hang in the air longer than they should. I hadn't noticed how steep the incline had become, nor how quiet it had gotten until I stopped for a brief rest. Sitting down on a rock, I realized that I hadn't heard any sounds for a while. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. It was unnerving, but I pushed it to the back of my mind. As I continued, the trail became more rugged. The smooth dirt path was replaced by loose rocks, tree roots, and uneven ground. It was a steeper climb now, and I had to focus more on my footing. It was also getting colder, and I found myself pulling my jacket tighter around me. The weather had been clear when I started, but now the clouds had thickened, and the wind was picking up. A faint drizzle started, and I knew I'd have to hurry if I wanted to make it to the waterfall before it really started pouring. The trail led me through a dense grove of pines, their needles thick on the ground. It felt even more isolated here. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and I stopped to listen. I could hear a faint sound, something distant, like the crack of a branch snapping. I wasn't sure if it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I kept moving, telling myself it was nothing. I was just being paranoid. I'd hiked this trail before, and nothing bad had ever happened. But the further I went, the more off it felt. The trees seemed to close in, and the path grew harder to follow. My boots slipped on the wet rocks, and the sound of the wind seemed to increase, howling through the trees. But still, there was no one around. No one had passed me in a while. I hadn't seen anyone since I left the stream crossing. I came to a fork in the trail. One path led up to the waterfall, while the other wound deeper into the woods. I had always taken the path to the waterfall before, but this time, something pulled me to the other one. I can't explain why I made that choice. Maybe I was just trying to get away from the growing sense of unease, or maybe I wanted to see where the other path led. Whatever the reason, I turned onto it. The trail quickly became more difficult. The trees were taller here, and the underbrush thicker. I had to push through branches and duck under low-hanging limbs. The trail was less defined, but I kept moving forward, determined to see where it would take me. But as the minutes passed, I began to feel more and more disoriented. The trail wasn't marked very well, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had made a wrong turn somewhere. The light was fading, and the drizzle had turned into a steady rain. My clothes were soaked through, and my backpack felt heavier with every step. I should have turned around, but I didn't. I pressed on, hoping that the trail would lead me back to something familiar. The silence in the woods was oppressive now, broken only by the sound of my footsteps and the rain hitting the ground. The feeling of being watched was stronger than ever, and I felt like I couldn't escape it. My heart was racing, and I could feel the panic building up inside me, but I kept walking, determined to find my way out. Then, I saw something that stopped me dead in my tracks. Through the trees, I saw a shape dark, large, and moving. It was difficult to make out in the dim light, but it was unmistakable. Someone or something was out there just ahead. I stood frozen, barely breathing, my heart thudding in my chest. I didn't know if I should call out or just keep moving, but I couldn't bring myself to make a sound. Slowly, I started to back up, trying not to make any noise. I was desperate to avoid whatever it was, but I couldn't see where it had gone. I turned around and began walking quickly, my pace quickening to a near jog as I tried to get away. The rain was coming down harder now, and the trail was slippery. My feet slid on the wet rocks, and I stumbled several times, barely catching myself. My hands were trembling as I wiped the water from my face. The woods around me felt more suffocating with each passing moment. The only sound I could hear was the pounding of the rain and my own frantic breathing. I didn't stop to look behind me. I didn't need to. I knew something or someone was following me. Every so often, I'd hear a rustle in the underbrush, just behind me, just out of sight. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. The panic was setting in now. I couldn't see the trail clearly anymore, and the world felt off-kilter, like I was walking in a dream. My mind raced, and I kept telling myself to stay calm, that I was just being paranoid. But that didn't stop the sense of urgency growing inside me. The trail suddenly opened up, and I found myself at the edge of a small clearing. The rain was still coming down, but the trees here were thinner, allowing a little more light to filter through. I stopped to catch my breath, scanning the area. I didn't know where I was or how I had gotten here, but I was starting to realize that I had wandered far off the main path. I was completely alone, and I had no idea how to get back. It was then that I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. They were soft, slow, but they were there. I whipped around, my heart leaping into my throat, but there was nothing. The clearing was empty. The woods, too, seemed still. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it. But then, just as I began to relax, I saw something move in the trees at the edge of the clearing. It was brief, a flicker of movement, but it was enough to send my heart racing again. I didn't wait to see more. I turned and ran. I've always loved hiking. It's something I've been doing for years, ever since I was old enough to walk well enough to keep up with my dad on the trails. Hiking became a way for me to disconnect from the daily grind, to get away from everything. And lately, it was exactly what I needed. It was a Saturday morning, and I had decided to take a solo hike through a trail I hadn't done in a while, about 6 miles out and back through some rugged terrain. The weather was perfect. The sun was just starting to rise, casting an amber glow on the horizon, and the air had that crisp chill that you only get in early spring, the kind that gives you a sharp, refreshing wake-up call. I had packed everything I needed: a water bottle, some granola bars, a small first aid kit, and a lightweight jacket, just in case the weather turned. The trailhead was located at the edge of a dense forest, where the trees were tall and tightly packed, and the ground was a bit muddy from some recent rains. The air smelled of pine and fresh earth. I began my hike, walking steadily along the well-maintained path, my boots crunching over the dry leaves and twigs that littered the ground. The trail quickly ascended, and soon the sounds of civilization, the faint hum of traffic and voices, faded behind me. I was alone now, completely immersed in the wilderness. The only noises were the occasional rustling of leaves, the distant call of birds, and the soft wind through the branches above. The quiet was soothing. As I walked, I noticed how the landscape around me was changing. The trail, which started as a smooth, compact dirt path, began to get rockier. There were more exposed roots twisting up from the earth, and the slope was steeper. The trees grew taller, and the forest felt denser, darker in places. The sunlight began to filter through the thick canopy of leaves, casting long, shifting shadows on the ground. After about an hour of steady walking, I reached a clearing. I stopped, taking a moment to look around. The view was stunning. Rolling hills in the distance, the trees stretching as far as I could see, and a small stream that trickled down the hillside, bubbling over rocks. I sat down on a large boulder to take a break. The sound of the water was soothing, and I could feel my muscles relaxing. It was peaceful, serene, but there was something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I stood up and stretched, trying to shake the feeling. Maybe it was just the isolation of being out here alone, but I couldn't help feeling a little uneasy, a slight twinge in the back of my mind, like there was something off, something I couldn't see. I pushed the thought aside. It was probably nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. I took a deep breath, grabbed my water bottle, and continued down the trail. The forest had always been my escape. It wasn't just the quiet or the solitude. It was the way it felt like everything else in the world faded away when I stepped into the woods. No traffic, no distractions, no deadlines. Just trees and dirt and the soft murmur of nature. I had hiked plenty of times before, always alone. It wasn't that I didn't enjoy company, but when it came to hiking, I preferred the peace of being by myself. This trip was supposed to be just another one of those peaceful days. Get out early, make it to the summit by noon, and then take my time on the descent. A quiet day of solitude and enjoying the beauty of the mountains. That was the plan. But plans often don't account for what nature throws at you. I set off early as usual. The air was crisp, and the sun hadn't fully risen above the horizon yet, casting everything in a cool, dim light. The trail started off easy, winding through dense woods, the kind of forest that felt endless. The tall pine trees formed a canopy above me, blocking most of the sunlight, making everything feel slightly damp and shadowed. The ground beneath my boots was soft, but firm enough to provide good footing as I made my way up the trail. For the first hour or so, I was just moving along, the rhythm of my boots on the trail and the sound of birds in the trees the only company. The air smelled fresh, almost sweet, mixed with the scent of wet earth and pine needles. Perfect morning, really. But soon, as the trail began to climb, I started to notice something strange. The birds were quieter than usual. Normally, there was a constant background hum of life. The calls of birds, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the buzzing of insects. But today, all of that was missing. It was just quiet, too quiet. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just my imagination. It was early after all. Maybe the animals were still asleep, or maybe the day hadn't fully woken up yet. But the silence stuck with me, and as I continued, I found myself listening more closely, my ears straining for any sounds of life. Another hour passed. The trail was getting steeper, and the trees were starting to thin out, the underbrush more rugged, but I was used to this. I was gaining elevation, which meant the summit was getting closer. But that silence, it still hung in the air, oppressive and thick, like something was holding its breath. At one point, I stopped for a water break. I took off my pack and sat on a fallen log, staring out over the forest below me. It was still early enough that the sun hadn't quite reached the valley, and the world below me was a mixture of shadows and soft light. It looked peaceful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I looked around, as if expecting to see something lurking in the trees, but there was nothing. The silence continued, stretching on, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I drank some water, put the bottle away, and shouldered my pack again, ready to move on. But as I stood up, I heard something, a snap of a twig. The sound was faint, but it came from just off the trail, somewhere to my right, deep in the woods. I froze, my heart suddenly pounding in my chest. I hadn't seen anyone on the trail since I started, and there shouldn't have been anyone else out here. I waited, listening. The noise didn't repeat. My rational brain told me it was probably just an animal. A deer, maybe, or a squirrel. but the eerie silence that still hung in the air made my instincts scream that something wasn't right. I took a deep breath and kept moving, pushing the uneasy feeling to the back of my mind. I told myself it was nothing, but every few steps, I would pause, listening just to make sure nothing was following me. The silence felt heavier now, like it was pressing against my ears. It wasn't just the lack of sound, it was the feeling of being watched. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like something, or someone, was out there, just out of sight. By the time I reached a small clearing about an hour later, I was starting to feel the weight of the silence pressing down on me. I could feel my body tense, every muscle coiled and ready, but I kept moving forward, even as my instincts screamed at me to turn around. The summit wasn't far now, and I couldn't bring myself to turn back, not when I was so close to reaching it. The trail grew narrower as I approached the ridge. The trees thinned out, replaced by jagged rocks and uneven ground. The air was thinner up here, a little harder to breathe, and the sky above had turned a crisp blue. But even though the sun had fully risen, the unsettling quiet remained. It was like the world had been frozen in time, and all I could hear now was the occasional shuffle of my boots against the gravel path. Then, just as I was about to round a bend in the trail, I heard it again. A sound, clear and unmistakable, the snap of a twig. But this time it was much closer. It was as though someone was right behind me. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat, but there was nothing, just trees. The trail was empty. Still, that feeling of being watched had intensified. My skin was prickling, and I could feel my heart beating harder, faster. I told myself to calm down. It was probably just another animal. There were plenty of deer up here, and they moved quietly. Maybe it was just a deer, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I tried to focus on the path ahead of me, but every few steps, I kept glancing over my shoulder. The trees around me felt like they were closing in, and the silence was overwhelming, as if the forest was holding its breath. I was close now, just a few more minutes of hiking, and I'd be at the summit. But as I rounded the final bend, something stopped me in my tracks. Ahead of me, standing in the middle of the trail, was a figure. It wasn't what I expected. It wasn't a person, not really. It was a figure, crouched low to the ground, with long limbs and a twisted posture that made my stomach churn. It was like something out of a nightmare. Its body was unnaturally long, its arms bent at odd angles, and its face, I couldn't even see its face clearly, but there was something about its eyes, wide, unblinking, and staring directly at me. I stood there, frozen, my heart hammering in my chest. My first instinct was to run, but I couldn't move. I couldn't take my eyes off the thing. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there watching me. And then slowly it began to move, not toward me, but away from me, slinking back into the underbrush, vanishing into the shadows like a ghost. I was paralyzed, my mind racing to make sense of what I had just seen. My legs felt weak, but I forced myself to take a step forward, then another and another until I was moving again, my pace quickening, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't know what that thing was. I didn't want to know. All I knew was that I needed to get off the mountain. I needed to leave, and I needed to do it fast. The rest of the descent was a blur. I moved quickly, stumbling over rocks and roots, not caring about the trail anymore, just focused on getting to the bottom. Every step felt like an eternity, and every crack of a twig or rustle in the bushes made me jump. It wasn't until I reached the trailhead that I finally slowed down, gasping for air, my heart still pounding in my chest. The woods were as quiet as ever, but I didn't care. I was out. I was safe. I didn't tell anyone about what I saw. What would I say? Who would believe me? But I knew what I saw, and I knew I wasn't going back up that mountain anytime soon. The forest had always been my escape, but not anymore. Now it felt like something was out there, something watching, waiting, and I didn't want to find out what it was. I'd always considered myself a seasoned hiker, someone who knew the wilderness and could handle whatever nature threw my way. I'd been on countless trails, walked through dense forests, scaled steep mountainsides, and crossed rushing rivers. Nothing had ever really fazed me. But this hike, it turned out, was different. It was a late autumn day when I decided to take on a solo hike through the rugged hills near my town. I'd heard about this trail from a few friends who had raved about its beauty, but I knew there wasn't much information about it online. The more I thought about it, the more I was drawn to the idea of exploring something a little more remote, a bit off the beaten path. I parked my car at the trailhead and unloaded my gear. A heavy-duty backpack, plenty of water, snacks, a first aid kit, and my trusty compass. The air was crisp, and the smell of pine and damp earth filled my lungs. There wasn't a soul in sight. That, in itself, felt odd. Normally, the trailheads are at least a little populated with other hikers, but not today. It was just me. I checked the map one more time, though I had a feeling I wouldn't need it. I'd walked enough trails to recognize when something felt off, and so far, I didn't get that sense. The trail started off easily enough. A well-worn path with a gentle slope through a dense forest of tall pines and oaks. The sun filtered through the canopy, casting dappled light on the ground, and the air was cool, perfect for hiking. The further I went, the quieter it became. The usual sounds of birds chirping, the rustling of animals in the underbrush. Those sounds slowly faded until all I could hear was my own footsteps crunching against the forest floor. It didn't bother me at first. I was used to hiking alone, but something about the silence felt too absolute, too unnerving. About an hour into the hike, I reached a clearing. The trees parted to reveal a small creek, its waters gurgling softly as they flowed over rocks and pebbles. I stopped to refill my water bottle, watching the water swirl around my feet. The stillness around me was thick, almost oppressive. I shook off the feeling and continued on, following the creek's path for another few miles. The trail became less defined as I ventured further into the forest. The markers were few and far between, and the foliage began to thicken. A small part of me thought about turning back, but I pushed the thought aside. I had the map, after all, and I knew I could always turn around if I needed to. The next few hours blurred together as I lost myself in the hike, moving deeper into the forest. The trees grew taller, the air colder, and the shadows longer as the sun dipped lower in the sky. At some point, I noticed something strange. There was no sign of wildlife. No birds, no small animals darting between the trees. Not even the sound of the wind. It was as though the entire forest had gone silent, just like before. That's when I noticed the tracks. At first, they were hard to see, just faint impressions in the damp earth. But as I looked closer, I realized they were fresh. Too fresh. They looked like boot prints, large and deep, as if someone or something had passed through recently. They were spaced too evenly for a wild animal, but too irregular to be a human's natural stride. I paused, my stomach knotting up. There was something unsettling about those prints. They didn't match any boots I owned, and there was something off about the way they had been left behind. As I squatted down to get a better look, I felt an uneasy sensation creep up my spine. A chill not from the temperature, but from something else. Without thinking, I took a few steps to the side, moving away from the tracks and continuing on my path. The feeling of being watched crept up again, this time much stronger than before. My instincts screamed at me to turn around and head back, but I stubbornly ignored them. I'd gone too far to turn back now. The trail grew even more treacherous. The ground was uneven, the trees thicker and closer together, casting long shadows across the path. It felt like the forest was closing in around me, and that feeling only intensified when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. At first, I told myself it was just my imagination, or maybe a deer moving through the trees. But the footsteps weren't random. They were rhythmic, deliberate, like someone was walking directly behind me. I froze. The sound stopped. My breath caught in my throat. I spun around, expecting to see someone there. But the trail was empty. Nothing but trees and the faint sound of the creek in the distance. I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, for what felt like an eternity, but nothing changed. The forest was still. It wasn't until I started walking again that I realized just how quiet everything had become. I had been so focused on the footsteps that I hadn't noticed the other sound, the sound of my own breathing. It was too quiet. The forest should have been alive, but it wasn't. It was dead silent. By this point, the sun was just about gone, and the last bits of daylight were slipping away. The trail had vanished completely, and I was left trying to navigate by memory and instinct. That's when I stumbled. The ground gave way beneath me, and I tumbled down a steep incline, landing hard on a bed of rocks and dirt. I lay there for a moment, stunned. My head throbbed, and my wrist felt sore from where I twisted it during the fall. I pushed myself to my feet, taking a deep breath to steady myself. As I glanced around, trying to make sense of where I had landed, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, about 50 yards away, was a campfire. Its glow flickered faintly through the trees, casting shadows that seemed to dance unnaturally. I should have turned around right then. Something about that fire didn't sit right with me. It was too close to where I had just fallen, and there was no way I'd missed it earlier. Whoever had made it hadn't been there long, but they also hadn't made any effort to hide it. I thought about leaving, but I couldn't. The idea of being lost, alone, in the woods as night fell, was too terrifying to even imagine. So instead, I approached the fire, slowly, cautiously, keeping my steps light. I didn't want to make a sound. As I got closer, the smell of burning would fill my nose, but there was something else, something rancid, like spoiled meat. My stomach turned, and I felt the bile rise in my throat. Then I saw it. Near the fire, just barely visible in the dim light, was a pile of belongings. Discarded clothing, backpacks, and a pair of boots that looked far too large. But there was no person, no one around. I scanned the area, my eyes darting back and forth. There were no signs of life, no movement, no noise. But the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. I was sure someone or something was out there, hidden in the shadows, waiting. Suddenly, I heard a twig snap behind me. My heart stopped. I turned around quickly, but again, there was nothing. Nothing but the trees and the stillness of the night. It was then I realized how truly alone I was. The fire crackled, the only sound in an otherwise empty forest. I had no idea what had happened to whoever was supposed to be here, but one thing was clear: this place was not safe. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and I had to fight the urge to run. After what felt like forever, I made the decision to leave. I didn't care about the fire or whatever it was that had made it. I just needed to get out of there. The hike back was a blur. I moved quickly, taking cautious steps as I retraced my path, desperate to leave the eerie campfire and its unsettling presence behind. It wasn't until I reached the edge of the forest and saw the headlights of my car in the distance that I finally let out a breath. I was safe. I was out of the woods. As I drove away, I couldn't help but wonder what had happened in that part of the forest. Who had made the campfire and where had they gone? There were no answers, but I knew one thing for sure: I would never hike that trail again. Some places, I realized, are better left unexplored. I've always been one for pushing limits, testing myself when I feel the need for something more than just the routine of everyday life. It was a Saturday morning when I decided to take on Black Ridge, a popular hiking trail near my town. It wasn't the hardest hike by any means, but something about it felt different this time. The air was crisp, and the sky was clouded with heavy clouds that looked like they might open up at any moment. But that didn't deter me. I was used to hikes that took me through tougher terrain, and the idea of a challenge made my pulse quicken in a good way. I parked my car at the small trailhead parking lot, which had a couple of cars already there. A good sign, I thought. People around meant safety. Still, there was something about the way the wind rustled through the trees, something uneasy that made me hesitate for a second before grabbing my backpack and water bottle from the back seat. Maybe it was just the unfamiliarity of the place. It had been a while since I'd been out this far. My boots were sturdy, my jacket was weather-resistant, and my map was on my phone. I was ready for whatever came. The trail started off easy, winding through a dense forest with towering pines and a few oaks scattered here and there. The path was soft underfoot, with layers of dry leaves and pine needles covering most of the ground. The sound of crunching leaves was the only noise, and the occasional bird call overhead. It felt peaceful at first, the sort of hike that would normally clear your head. I made my way along, following the orange trail markers that were painted on trees and rocks. I wasn't in any rush. I liked to take my time on hikes, enjoying the scenery and letting my thoughts wander. But as I went further into the woods, I noticed something odd. The air had started to feel heavier, not in a literal sense, but in a way that made my stomach churn a bit. It was as if the world around me was quietly pressing in, like the trees were closing in on the path. The sound of birds had nearly vanished, replaced by an eerie silence that was so complete it almost felt unnatural. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination. I'd been on trails in much denser woods than this, and they hadn't bothered me. But today something was off. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even though I was completely alone. The trail began to steepen as I climbed higher up the ridge. The trees thinned out, and the forest gave way to open rocky terrain. The wind picked up, howling through the rocks and whipping my face with cold gusts. It felt good in a way, refreshing, but also a little unsettling. My jacket flapped against my sides as I made my way up, forcing myself to stay focused on the path ahead. I wasn't sure how long I'd been hiking, maybe 2 or 3 hours, but as I neared the top of the ridge, I saw something strange. At first, it was just a figure, standing motionless about 50 feet away on a narrow ledge. I stopped in my tracks, my heart skipping a beat as I studied the silhouette. The person, or whatever it was standing perfectly still, facing away from me. At first, I thought maybe they were just another hiker enjoying the view. But then I noticed that they weren't moving at all. Not a single inch. I tried to call out, but the words caught in my throat. There was something about the stillness that made me hesitate, as if breaking the silence would shatter something fragile in the air. I squinted against the wind, but the figure remained motionless, unmoving, like part of the landscape. I took a step forward, then another, still unsure whether to call out or simply turn around and leave. But something in me urged caution. I wasn't a fearful person by nature, but there was something deeply wrong with the way that figure was standing there, completely still. It felt off. It wasn't just the solitude, it was the atmosphere. It felt as if the whole forest was holding its breath. As I moved a little closer, I realized the figure was standing just at the edge of a steep drop-off. One wrong step and they would be gone. My unease grew, my pulse quickening as I looked at the figure more closely. They were dressed in heavy outdoor gear, much like mine, but their back was to me, and there was no movement at all. The wind howled louder, but they remained frozen. My instinct was to leave, to head back down the trail and forget all about this strange encounter. But something tugged at me, an almost sick curiosity. I couldn't leave without knowing who or what this person was. So I took one more step forward. That was when everything shifted. The figure suddenly moved. It wasn't a normal movement. There was something jerky and unnatural about it, like it wasn't quite human. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, watching as the figure's head slowly turned toward me. It wasn't a sharp movement, it was deliberate, calculated. The face that stared back at me was blank, emotionless, like a mannequin. I couldn't make out any features except for the eyes, which were wide and unsettling, their whites too bright against the dim light. They were staring right at me, unblinking. I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of panic pressing down on my chest. My legs felt heavy, like I was rooted to the ground. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The wind had died down, and the world was completely silent. The figure didn't speak, didn't make a sound. But there was something in the way it stood that made every hair on the back of my neck stand on end. Without thinking, I turned and began to run. My boots pounded against the rocky ground, the sound of my breath ragged in my ears as I sprinted down the path. The air felt thicker now, like it was getting harder to breathe, harder to move. I could hear the crunch of gravel beneath my feet, and the distant sound of the wind picking up again, but I didn't dare look back. I ran harder, faster, until my legs screamed in protest, until my lungs felt like they were about to burst. Every step was a battle against the fear clawing at my insides, telling me to keep going, to not stop, no matter what. I didn't know why I felt so terrified. I couldn't explain it. I had hiked alone in worse conditions, but this felt different. It felt like I wasn't alone anymore. I reached the bottom of the ridge, the familiar path now visible ahead. The trees were denser here, and I didn't slow down, just kept running, feeling my legs starting to buckle beneath me. When I reached the trailhead, I didn't stop to catch my breath. I didn't even look around. I just kept walking, my feet moving faster and faster, until I reached my car. The parking lot was empty now, just the lonely stretch of gravel and the low hum of the engine as I slid into the driver's seat and locked the doors behind me. I was safe. I was out. The terror that had gripped me on that trail slowly began to fade as I gripped the steering wheel, my breath steadying, though my heart still raced. I started the car, the engine humming to life as I pulled out of the parking lot, eager to get back to the comfort of home. That was the last time I hiked Black Ridge. There's no explanation for what happened up there. No reason I can give you for the way I felt. All I know is that it was real. The figure, the fear, the pressing sensation that something was wrong. Everything about it was real, and it's something I'll never forget. But I was lucky. I made it out. And sometimes, when I'm driving home late at night, I think I hear something in the wind or feel eyes watching me from the woods, just beyond the trees. But I try not to think about it too much. I had been hiking for hours, lost in the rhythm of my steps and the solitude of the woods. The forest around me was thick, the trees towering high above with their branches swaying gently in the cool breeze. It had been a long time since I'd gone out like this, alone, deep into the woods, but something about the isolation was calming. Hiking used to be something I did with friends, but I found myself drawn to the quiet lately, hoping to clear my mind and enjoy the peace. The trail was rough. It was one of those paths that didn't get a lot of foot traffic, overgrown in places with the occasional fallen log that had to be climbed over or skirted around. I didn't mind it, though. The challenge made it feel more real, more adventurous. There was no one else around, just me and the forest. I had a map with me, but it wasn't much help. The trail wasn't marked clearly, and the GPS on my phone had been losing signal for the last hour. I stopped for a brief rest, sitting on a large rock that jutted out of the ground. My water bottle was nearly empty, and I hadn't seen a stream for miles. I checked my watch, noting that it was getting late. The sun, once high in the sky, was starting to dip behind the trees. I had underestimated how far I'd come, and now I was unsure whether I had the time to finish the hike and get back before dark. I'd planned to be out here for a few hours, but now, the thought of getting back to the trailhead in the fading light was making me uneasy. The thought of being lost didn't scare me. Not yet. But there was something about being out here, in the middle of nowhere, that made the quiet feel heavy. I stood up, shouldered my pack again, and continued walking, trying to push the creeping unease aside. The trail narrowed and became steeper, the ground soft and uneven. I had to watch my step, carefully placing each foot as the path twisted around boulders and through thick patches of brush. My legs were starting to ache, but I didn't want to turn back yet. The thought of finding my way back to the trailhead in the dark was less appealing than pushing through the last stretch of the hike, even if it was more exhausting. As I rounded a bend, I spotted something strange. A small clearing opened up ahead, and in the center of it, something that looked like a wooden structure caught my eye. It wasn't big, just a small shack of some sort, built into the side of the hill. It was old and weathered, its roof sagging under the weight of years of exposure. I felt a strange pull to investigate, even though I knew I should be cautious. I didn't know who or what might be around these parts, and the idea of a building in the middle of the woods, abandoned and forgotten, set my instincts on edge. Curiosity won out, though. I approached the shack slowly, keeping my distance but unable to resist the urge to take a closer look. The closer I got, the more unsettling it felt. The air seemed thicker here, like the trees were closing in around me. The shack itself looked like it had been abandoned for a long time. Its wood was rotting, and the small window on the front was shattered, the glass long since gone. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened here, but I couldn't quite put my finger on why it felt so wrong. I circled around the shack, trying to see if there was an entrance. The door, what was left of it, hung loosely on its hinges. I hesitated for a moment, but then pushed it open, the creaking sound echoing too loudly in the silence. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of decay. It was empty except for some debris, broken furniture, a few old boxes, and piles of leaves that had blown in through the broken window. But as I stepped further into the shack, I noticed something strange on the floor. There were markings, scratches, scraped into the wooden floorboards. I crouched down, my heart pounding as I examined them more closely. It looked like something had been dragged across the floor, dragged with force. The lines were jagged and uneven, as if something heavy had been dragged through here. I ran my fingers along the grooves, feeling a chill run up my spine. I stood up quickly, my mind racing. Something about this place felt off, like I shouldn't be here. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. In the far corner of the room, half hidden by the darkness, was a large, rusted metal box. It was heavy, and I couldn't resist the impulse to open it. My hands trembled as I pulled it open, the hinges screeching in protest. Inside, there was nothing but a few tattered cloths and a set of old, rusty tools. Nothing too alarming, but the feeling of unease only grew stronger. I backed out of the shack, my mind spinning. I couldn't stay here any longer. I had to get moving. But as I turned to leave, something made me stop. A noise, faint but unmistakable, came from behind me. It was a rustling, like someone or something was moving through the underbrush outside. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't know what to make of it, but the sound was too deliberate to be the wind or an animal. For a moment, I stood frozen, listening. The rustling stopped, but the hairs on the back of my neck were standing on end. I slowly began to back away, my eyes scanning the trees around me, but nothing emerged. No movement, no sound, only the eerie quiet of the forest. I didn't know why, but I felt like I was being watched. Every little sound made me jump. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the bushes, seemed louder now. My breath came faster, and my hands were slick with sweat. I turned and hurried down the trail, my pace quickening. The trail felt longer than before. The path seemed to stretch on endlessly, the shadows growing longer with every step. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. It wasn't a physical presence, but a weight, a tension in the air that made it hard to breathe. I pushed myself harder, my legs burning as I climbed over rocks and roots. The sun was nearly gone now, and the forest was plunging into darkness. I hadn't seen any signs of the trailhead in a long time, and panic began to set in. I tried to focus, to calm myself, but the pressure was mounting. The trail was getting harder to follow, the ground rougher, and every step seemed like I was going deeper into the forest. My thoughts were clouded with fear, and I found myself questioning how far I had strayed from the path I knew. And then, just as the last light of day began to fade, I saw something ahead. The faint glow of a campfire flickered through the trees. I hesitated, unsure whether I should approach or continue on my own. But the thought of more company, of human presence, felt like a relief. I followed the light, my steps slow and cautious. The campfire grew brighter, and soon I could see the silhouette of a small camp setup. A tent, a fire pit, and a few logs arranged around it. My heart thumped in my chest as I stepped closer. I wasn't sure if I should call out or just observe, but before I could decide, a voice broke the silence. A man stood up from the fire, his face hidden by the shadow of his hood. He looked as surprised as I was to see someone else. We both stood there for a long moment, the fire crackling between us. He didn't speak, and neither did I, but something about his presence was comforting. I wasn't alone anymore. I wasn't lost. Finally, he gave a small nod, as if recognizing the need for silence in such a place, and I knew then that I was no longer in danger. I wasn't lost anymore. I had always been the kind of person who enjoyed being out in the wild. There's something about the quiet of nature, the smell of pine trees, and the rhythm of your own breath as you make your way up a rugged trail. I'd gone hiking countless times, always keeping to well-traveled paths, never veering too far off course. But this time, something felt different. It started as a simple idea. I was in a new area for work, staying in a small town nestled between mountains, and I figured it would be a good opportunity to explore. The locals spoke highly of a nearby trail, one that wound through dense woods and offered a beautiful view of a hidden lake at the top. It didn't seem too difficult, only about 8 miles round trip, with a steady incline. I packed a small backpack with the essentials: water, a snack, a first aid kit, and my phone, though I didn't plan on using it unless necessary. I checked the weather, clear skies, nothing to worry about. I left the town early in the morning, hoping to catch the sunrise from the peak. The air was cool, fresh with that crisp scent of dew and earth. The trail started off easy. The path was clear with a few loose rocks here and there. I quickly settled into my pace, enjoying the sound of my boots crunching against the gravel and the occasional chirp of birds in the trees. The woods were dense, but the path was wide enough to feel safe, and there was a calming isolation to it. As I hiked, I thought about how good it felt to disconnect, to be alone with nature for a while. As I climbed higher, the trees grew thicker. The path twisted and turned, but it was still manageable. I had seen a few other hikers earlier in the day, but they had all turned back after the first mile or so. They seemed to think the trail was too tough or didn't want to go all the way to the lake. Their loss, I thought. I was determined to see it through. Around the halfway point, the trail became steeper. The trees began to thin, and the underbrush got thicker. It wasn't just bushes anymore. It was low-hanging branches and tangled vines that seemed to slow me down with every step. I didn't mind, though. There was a part of me that enjoyed the challenge, the feeling of pushing through something difficult, even if it was just a hike. But then things started to change. Slowly at first, and then more noticeably. The trail seemed to narrow. The dense forest around me created a heavy silence, almost suffocating. I couldn't hear the birds anymore, nor the rustling of small animals. It felt like the forest had closed in on me, swallowing up any sound that might have come from the outside world. I wasn't scared, not yet, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping up on me. It was as if I was no longer just hiking through the woods. I was walking through something older, something forgotten. The air felt heavier, colder, and the light from the sun grew dimmer as I climbed higher. Then, I noticed something strange. Off to the side of the trail, there was a pile of rocks. It looked like a cairn, but it was different. Instead of a simple stack of rocks, this one seemed off. It wasn't a neat pile. The rocks were jagged and uneven, some of them almost hidden under the overgrowth. It didn't look like something a hiker would build to mark the trail. It looked like it had been there a long time, maybe even decades. I paused for a moment, staring at it. I didn't know why, but I felt like I should be wary of it. I shook the thought off and continued walking, but the unease lingered. My mind was already starting to play tricks on me. The trail became more difficult. The incline was steep, and the ground beneath my boots felt loose. My steps were slower now, more deliberate, as I had to watch each one carefully. The trees seemed to grow even denser, the shadows deeper. I didn't realize it at first, but the sun had shifted, and the light was now filtering through the branches at strange angles, casting long, eerie shadows on the ground. The path twisted again, and I found myself in an area where the trees were so close together that it felt like I was walking through a tunnel. There was no breeze, no rustling of leaves, just the silence. I stopped, wiped the sweat from my brow, and took a deep breath. It was quieter than it had been before. I had to keep going. I had come this far, and the lake was just a little further up. I pressed on. Another half-mile passed, and the forest finally started to open up. The trees began to thin out, and I saw the first glimpse of the lake through a gap in the branches. I smiled, knowing I was close to the end. But as I made my way toward the clearing, something caught my eye. It was a trail sign, but it wasn't one I had seen before. It was old, faded, weathered by years of neglect. The lettering was almost illegible, but I could make out the word danger. The sign was leaning to one side, almost as if it had been knocked over. It wasn't placed on the trail like a typical marker. It was off to the side, partially hidden by the brush. I felt a knot in my stomach. I could still see the lake, the shimmering surface through the trees. But something about the sign made me hesitate. I wasn't sure why, but I had this sudden urge to turn back. It wasn't fear exactly, it was more like a warning, something primal. It told me I shouldn't be here, that I had gone far enough. But I didn't turn back. I kept walking, ignoring the nagging feeling that had started to crawl up my spine. I needed to see the lake to finish the hike. It was only a little further. I pushed through the trees and emerged into the clearing. The lake was smaller than I expected, nestled between the rocks and surrounded by tall grass. It was beautiful in its own way, still and serene. But it wasn't peaceful. There was something wrong about the place. The air felt damp, almost stagnant, and there was a faint smell in the air, like decaying leaves or wet earth. I looked around, but there was no one else there. It was completely still. I walked closer to the shore, my boots crunching on the dry grass. As I stood by the edge of the water, something made me look up. Across the lake, on the other side, there was a small clearing just beyond the trees. It was hard to see clearly, but I thought I saw something. Maybe a figure, maybe just a trick of the light. My heart raced for a moment, but I shook it off. It was just my mind playing tricks on me again. I stood there for a while, staring at the water, letting my mind wander. The quiet of the lake was almost suffocating now. The more I looked at it, the more I realized how wrong it felt. There was nothing calming about this place. It wasn't peaceful. It wasn't beautiful. Felt wrong. I turned back to head down the trail, but as I did, I heard something. It wasn't a voice or a sound I could pinpoint. It was a low, guttural noise, like something moving in the woods behind me. My stomach dropped. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the lake, the trees, and the ever-deepening silence. I didn't wait another second. My heart was pounding, and I quickly began retracing my steps. I wanted out. I wanted to leave. As I made my way back down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. My footsteps seemed louder now, echoing in the silence of the woods. Every rustle in the underbrush made me jump, and the shadows seemed to grow longer and darker. I couldn't explain it. I didn't know why, but the woods felt alive, as if they were closing in on me. The trees weren't just trees, they were watching, waiting. I had to get out. I had to get back to where the path opened up again. It took longer than I expected to retrace my steps. The trail seemed different now, unfamiliar. The air was heavier, and I felt disoriented, like I wasn't walking the same path anymore. The further I went, the more I started to question if I was even going the right way. But then, finally, I saw the sign. The one I had passed earlier, the one that warned of danger. But this time, it wasn't leaning. It was upright, perfectly placed on the side of the trail, like it had been there the whole time. I didn't stop to look at it again. I just kept walking. And as I made my way back to the town, I realized that the silence had lifted. The air felt lighter. I could hear the distant hum of life again. The birds, the wind, even the sound of cars far off in the distance. When I finally made it back to my car, I didn't look back. I didn't even want to. Something about that hike, something about the trail, the lake, the woods had unsettled me more than I cared to admit. I wasn't sure what it was, but I knew one thing for sure. I wouldn't be going back there. It was early spring when I decided to take a solo hike on the Black Ridge Trail. I had been to this trail before, years ago with friends, but this time I was going alone. Something about the quiet of the forest and the solitude felt like exactly what I needed. My job had been stressful lately, and the constant pressure had built up a weight I was eager to shed. So, I packed my backpack with essentials: water, snacks, a first aid kit, and my trusty map, and headed out, not knowing that this hike would turn into something I'd never forget. The weather that day was perfect: clear skies, a gentle breeze, and temperatures hovering just above 50 degrees. I knew the trail well enough to not be worried about getting lost, though I did keep the map in my back pocket just in case. It was around 9 a.m. when I arrived at the trailhead, and I was the only one there. Not unusual, I thought. It was a Tuesday, and most people didn't go hiking on weekdays. I quickly locked my car and set off into the woods, breathing in the fresh scent of pine and damp earth. The trail started easy enough. It was mostly flat, winding through thick forests of oak and birch. The path was well maintained, and it seemed like every few yards there was a bench or a small clearing. The only sounds were the occasional bird calls and the crunch of leaves under my boots. I felt calm, relaxed, and free from the usual weight of daily life. As I walked, I tried to keep my pace steady. I wasn't rushing anywhere, and I made sure to drink plenty of water to stay hydrated. After about an hour, the trail started to get steeper. I knew this part would be a challenge, but I didn't mind. The climb was gradual, and the air grew cooler as I ascended. There was something peaceful about the solitude of the forest. No other hikers in sight, just the rustling of leaves and the occasional crack of a branch in the distance. At one point, the trail veered into a small ravine, where a shallow stream trickled over smooth rocks. I stopped to catch my breath and refilled my water bottle, sitting on a large boulder by the stream. The sound of the water flowing was soothing, and for a brief moment, I felt completely at ease. I couldn't remember the last time I had been this relaxed, but the moment didn't last long. Just as I was getting up to continue, I noticed something strange. A sound, distant at first, like something heavy moving through the forest. At first, I thought it was just the wind or maybe a deer, but it didn't sound quite right. It was too consistent, too deliberate. I stood still for a moment, listening, but the sound faded. I brushed it off as nothing and continued on my way, but the unease stayed with me. The next section of the trail was much steeper. I had to use my hands to steady myself on the rocks, climbing higher and higher. My legs burned, but I pushed through, knowing the summit was just up ahead. The forest began to thin out, and I could see the outlines of distant peaks through the trees. It was quiet, too quiet, and for the first time since I started, I began to feel like I was being watched. It was a ridiculous thought, of course. There was no one else on the trail, and the idea of being followed seemed absurd. But the feeling wouldn't go away. I kept my eyes ahead, focusing on the path. The trail was narrowing now, and the trees were growing taller, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. It felt like I was walking through a tunnel of green. Every so often, I'd glance back, half expecting to see someone behind me, but no one ever was. Still, that feeling of being watched lingered. After what felt like hours, I reached the summit. The view was breathtaking. Rolling hills in every direction, valleys dotted with farms and small towns far below. I took a deep breath, enjoying the cool, fresh air. I felt a sense of accomplishment, a relief that I had made it to the top. I sat on a large rock and took out some snacks, savoring the peace that only the mountains could offer. There was no one around to disturb me, just me, the rocks, the trees, and the sky. But that peace didn't last either. I wasn't sure what triggered it at first, but as I sat there, eating my granola bar, a strange noise broke the silence. It wasn't the wind, not a bird, and certainly not a squirrel. It was something else, something heavier, something moving through the forest below me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It sounded like footsteps. I strained my ears, listening intently. There it was again, the unmistakable sound of someone or something moving through the brush. My first instinct was to dismiss it. Maybe it was another hiker, I told myself. But then, I remembered I hadn't seen anyone on the trail in hours. I stood up quickly, feeling my muscles tense. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I scanned the area, but all I could see was the wilderness stretching out before me. No one was there, and yet, that feeling of being watched was overwhelming now. I grabbed my pack and started walking again, faster than before. My steps quickened, though I didn't want to admit why. I told myself I was just being paranoid, but the footsteps, the ones I couldn't quite place, kept echoing in my mind. The descent back down was just as challenging, but now it was more than just physical exhaustion. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was behind me, following me, always just out of sight. Every rustle of the leaves, every snap of a twig, made my pulse quicken. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things, but my gut told me otherwise. I tried to focus on my footing, on the trail ahead, but the nagging sensation of being followed wouldn't leave me. As I reached the ravine where the stream had been earlier, I stopped again. I was breathing hard now, not just from the hike, but from the anxiety that was creeping up on me. I turned around, expecting to see something, anything, behind me, but there was nothing. The forest was still, too still. I took another few steps down the path, and that's when I saw it. A footprint, fresh, clearly visible in the soft dirt, but it was too big to be mine. It was the size of a large boot, and it was too close to the path to be from someone who had been walking ahead of me. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. Whoever had made that print had been close, too close. I turned back around and started walking faster, no longer caring about the beauty of the trail or the landscape. My sole focus was getting back to the car, getting back to safety. The forest felt different now, hostile, unfamiliar. I was acutely aware of every sound, every movement in the trees. I didn't look back anymore. I didn't want to. The rest of the hike was a blur. I kept my pace steady, only stopping once to catch my breath. But even that didn't ease the knot in my stomach. I just wanted to be done. I just wanted to be out of there. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, I reached the trailhead. My car was still there, parked in the same spot. I unlocked the door quickly and got inside, slamming it shut behind me. My hands were shaking as I started the engine and drove away, not looking back once. The feeling of being watched didn't leave me until I hit the main road and saw other cars passing by, other people out in the world. When I finally got home, I checked myself over for ticks and bruises. Nothing, but that sense of dread lingered. It wasn't until days later that I realized the worst part. There hadn't been any footprints behind me on the trail after I saw the first one. It was as if the person, or whatever it was, had been ahead of me the entire time. I haven't gone back to that trail since. It was one of those perfect autumn days, the kind where the sky was so clear you could see every single ridge of the mountains in the distance. I had decided to head out on a solo hike. I'd been looking forward to it for weeks, and with the weather cooperating, I was more than ready to be out in nature again. Hiking had always been my escape from everything. Life could be chaotic, and sometimes you just needed to be surrounded by quiet woods and nothing else. I set off early, the sun barely peeking over the horizon, and the chill of the morning air still hanging in the trees. The trail I chose was a bit off the beaten path. I'd hiked it once before with a group, but this time, I wanted to take it alone. I figured that after a few hours of climbing and walking, I'd find a nice, secluded spot to sit and eat the packed lunch I had brought with me. I packed light but made sure to carry the essentials: a map, my water bottle, a few snacks, and my phone in case of an emergency. I wasn't completely naive about the risks of hiking alone, but I'd done enough trips to know how to stay cautious. The first couple of hours went smoothly. The trail was well marked, and the landscape around me was a mixture of tall pines and open clearings with patches of wildflowers. The smell of damp earth filled the air, and the crunch of fallen leaves underfoot made a soothing rhythm. I was in my element. The solitude was refreshing, and for a moment, I felt a strange connection to the world around me. The distant sounds of birds chirping and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind were the only things I could hear. But as I continued, the trail started to change. It became narrower, and the trees grew thicker, blocking out more of the sunlight. The air was cooler now, and the atmosphere felt heavier, more enclosed. Still, I didn't feel alarmed. I'd been through more challenging trails before, and I trusted my instincts. As I rounded a bend, I noticed a small clearing up ahead. I figured it might be a good spot to stop for a rest. When I reached it, I sat down on a large rock, taking a moment to drink some water and enjoy the quiet. Everything around me felt peaceful, almost like time had slowed down. The breeze whispered through the trees, and for a second, I let my guard down. I checked my watch, noting that it was almost noon. I still had a good amount of daylight left, and I planned to keep going for another hour before turning back. My lunch was simple, just a few sandwiches and a granola bar. I ate quickly, enjoying the quiet solitude, but as I was finishing up, something caught my eye in the distance. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light or a shadow playing between the trees. But then I saw it again. A figure, just barely visible, standing motionless between the trunks of two trees. I froze, my heart rate speeding up. The figure didn't move, and it was too far away to make out any details. But the sensation of being watched was unmistakable. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling. It was probably just another hiker, maybe someone who had stopped for a break or was resting behind the trees. I hadn't seen anyone on the trail for the past hour, but I didn't think much of it. People often took their time when hiking, and not everyone followed the same path. I gathered my things and stood up, deciding to continue on my way. As I turned to leave the clearing, I glanced back one more time. The figure was still there, unmoving. My stomach twisted. Something about the way it stood there felt wrong, like it was waiting for me to make a move. But I quickly dismissed the thought. I was just overthinking it. I continued along the trail, trying to push the image of the figure out of my mind. The path twisted and turned, winding through a denser section of forest. The sun was lower now, and shadows stretched long across the ground. I started to feel a slight unease, but I couldn't pinpoint why. The sounds around me were still normal, rustling leaves, the occasional call of a bird, but there was a quietness now, almost too quiet. By the time I reached a particularly steep section of the trail, I had to concentrate on my footing. The rocks were slippery, and the incline was steeper than I remembered. I was beginning to feel a bit more worn out, but I kept going. The figure from earlier was still on my mind, though. It had been too long since I'd seen anyone else, and I was starting to wonder if I was being overly cautious. The woods could play tricks on your mind when you were alone. When I reached the top of the hill, I stopped to catch my breath. The view was breathtaking. From this point, I could see the valley below, the patchwork of trees in various shades of green, yellow, and red. It was beautiful. I stood there for a moment, just taking it all in, trying to push away the nagging feeling in the back of my mind. That's when I heard it. A faint sound, barely audible at first. A snap of a twig, then a rustle of leaves. I whipped my head around, my heart pounding. The forest was still. I tried to convince myself that it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but something about the sound didn't sit right. It wasn't the usual noises you'd hear from wildlife. I strained my ears, trying to listen more carefully. The rustling was closer now, and it was more deliberate. Not like an animal moving through the underbrush, but something else, someone else. I glanced around, but the trees were thick, and the trail ahead was empty. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. Someone was out there, watching me. My instincts kicked in, and I knew I needed to be cautious. But I didn't want to panic. There was still a good hour of daylight left, and I figured if I kept moving, I'd be fine. So I did just that. I continued walking, trying to maintain a steady pace, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every now and then, I'd hear another rustle behind me. It was subtle, but it was there. My mind raced. Was it a person? An animal? Was it something else entirely? The trail began to narrow again, and the trees closed in around me. The air felt colder now, and the once peaceful sounds of the forest had vanished. It was eerily quiet. My footsteps seemed louder than usual, echoing in the stillness. Then, as I rounded a bend in the trail, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, at the edge of the path, was a large, dark shape, almost like a pile of rocks or debris. But it wasn't. As I got closer, I realized what it was. A backpack. A heavy, dark backpack, laying abandoned on the trail. There were no signs of anyone around. No footprints leading away from it. Just the bag, sitting there in the middle of the path, like it had been placed there for someone to find. I stopped in my tracks. The air felt thick, and a knot formed in my stomach. There was no way someone had just left a backpack like this here. Not on a trail like this where few people came. It didn't make sense. I stepped closer, my eyes scanning the area for any signs of movement. Nothing. The forest was silent. I glanced at the bag, then back at the trail. I debated whether or not to investigate. It felt wrong, like it was a trap. but curiosity gnawed at me, and I couldn't help myself. Slowly, I crouched down and reached for the zipper on the backpack. It was cold to the touch, like it had been there for a while. As I opened it, my stomach churned. Inside were supplies, extra water bottles, a small first aid kit, a few snacks, and a flashlight. Nothing seemed out of place. But then, underneath the supplies, I found something that made my heart race. A large hunting knife. The kind you'd use for skinning an animal or cutting through thick brush. The blade was stained with something dark. It wasn't a deep red, but it was enough to make me hesitate. I pulled my hand back quickly, the sense of dread growing in my chest. Something was definitely wrong. I had to leave. Now, I stood up and took a few steps back, my eyes still scanning the area. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to stay calm. I needed to think clearly. As I backed away from the bag, I heard something. A soft crunch of leaves, then another twig snap. It was faint, but it was there, and it was coming from behind me. I spun around, but again, there was nothing. The trail was empty, but the feeling didn't go away. It was stronger now, like I was being stalked. I turned and bolted, not caring about the trail anymore. I didn't stop to look back. My breath came in ragged gasps as I pushed myself faster, the adrenaline coursing through my veins. My mind raced, the image of the knife flashing in my thoughts. Was someone out there? Had they left it as a warning or worse, to set me up? The trail felt endless now, each step heavier than the last. The rustling was behind me, getting closer, but I didn't dare turn around to check. My heart hammered in my chest, and the sound of my feet hitting the ground was deafening in my ears. Finally, I reached a clearing that led to a wider part of the trail. I could see the parking lot in the distance, the outline of my car just visible through the trees. My legs burned, but I pushed on, ignoring the fatigue. The trail felt like it was closing in around me, but the parking lot was... I've always enjoyed hiking alone. There's something about being on the trail, surrounded by nothing but trees, rocks, and dirt that gives me a sense of peace. It's a kind of freedom that's hard to find in the chaos of everyday life. And for the most part, I didn't mind the solitude. In fact, I preferred it. I could go at my own pace, take breaks when I wanted to, and just enjoy being in the moment. But on that particular day, everything felt different. I was about 5 miles into my hike, deep in a forested area. The path was well-marked, though not exactly well-traveled. I hadn't seen another person since I started, and that was just the way I liked it. The sun had begun to dip low in the sky, casting long shadows over the trail. I glanced at my watch, 4:30 p.m. I knew I still had plenty of daylight left, but I wasn't in a rush. I'd planned to reach the overlook by sunset, and then head back to my car before nightfall. It should have been a simple enough hike. The trail wound through dense woods, the kind of forest where the trees are so close together you feel like you're walking through a tunnel. The air was thick with the smell of pine, the ground soft beneath my boots. Every so often, I'd stop to take a deep breath, letting the forest's quiet calm wash over me. It was therapeutic, the way the sounds of distant birds and rustling leaves could drown out the noise in my head. But the farther I went, the more I started to notice things that felt off. It wasn't anything obvious, just little things. The trail seemed to narrow, the trees growing taller and denser, blocking out more and more of the sky. The shadows cast by the trees grew longer, and a sense of unease crept up on me, though I couldn't explain why. I pushed the feeling aside. There was no reason to be paranoid. I'd hiked this trail before, and I knew it well. I was just letting my mind get carried away. About 10 minutes later, I came across a small stream running parallel to the trail. The sound of the water rushing over the rocks was soothing, and I decided to stop for a moment. I knelt down to drink some water from my bottle and took in the peaceful surroundings. But as I sat there, I noticed something strange. There was a faint smell in the air, not the usual fresh, earthy scent of the forest, but something different. It was faint, like wet soil, but with an underlying sharpness to it, almost metallic. I looked around, expecting to see something obvious that might explain it, but the forest seemed unchanged. I shook my head, standing up and deciding to keep moving. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe the stress of work was finally catching up to me. I didn't know, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As I walked, I noticed that the trail seemed to be getting steeper. The trees were still thick, but now the terrain was uneven, the ground littered with rocks and roots. I had to watch my step more carefully. There were no more signs of wildlife. No birds, no squirrels, not even the rustle of leaves. Just the faint sound of my footsteps crunching on the dirt. I kept climbing, trying to ignore the growing discomfort in my chest. The trail had always been challenging, but I didn't remember it being this hard. It was as if the forest had grown more oppressive, closing in around me. The air was getting heavier, too thick with the smell of damp earth. At the top of the next rise, I saw a break in the trees, a clearing. It was small, but it promised an open view. I quickened my pace, eager to reach it, thinking that maybe getting out of the dense woods would help clear my mind. But as I approached the clearing, something caught my eye. There was something lying in the grass. At first, I thought it was just a rock or a fallen log, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't. It was a pile of leaves and branches, roughly heaped together in a small mound. My heart skipped a beat as I approached it, my legs suddenly feeling heavy. There was something about that pile that didn't seem right. I crouched down, studying it more closely. The pile was too neat, too deliberate. The branches were arranged in a way that didn't match the natural chaos of the forest. And as I poked at it with a stick, I realized that the pile wasn't just leaves and branches. It was a nest? No, that didn't make sense. There were no animals nearby, no signs of nests in the area. But as I poked it again, the strange metallic scent hit me again, stronger this time. I recoiled, my stomach turning. I decided to move on. Maybe it was some animal's den or a hunter's trap. It didn't matter. It was probably just my imagination running wild. I stood up and took a deep breath, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me. But as I turned to leave, I froze. Something moved in the trees on the far side of the clearing. I couldn't see it clearly at first, but the movement was unmistakable. Something large, something watching. I stood there, frozen, staring at the spot where I'd seen the movement. My heart pounded in my chest. Was it an animal? A bear? Person? I didn't know, but I had a sinking feeling in my stomach. Whatever it was, it wasn't normal. It wasn't the kind of thing you see on a hiking trail. I quickly turned and began walking back down the trail, my pace picking up as I moved away from the clearing. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that I had just imagined it. But the feeling of being watched was still there, gnawing at me. I kept my eyes on the trail, my every sense on high alert. The forest seemed even more oppressive now, the trees looming over me as if they were closing in. My footsteps felt too loud, the air too thick. I wasn't sure how much time had passed, but the sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky. I had to keep moving. Just as I reached a small rise, I heard a sound behind me, a crack, like a twig snapping underfoot. I whipped around, my heart racing, but there was nothing there, just the forest, still and silent. I stood there for a moment, listening. The only sound was the distant rush of the stream, but my gut told me something was wrong. I didn't stop to look back again. I just kept moving, pushing myself to go faster, to get back to my car. I didn't care about the sunset anymore. All I wanted was to get out of those woods. The trail seemed to stretch on forever, the trees growing taller, the shadows deeper. I was certain I wasn't just imagining things now. Something was out there, something watching me, following me. I could hear it sometimes, the faint rustling of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig. Every time I turned around, there was nothing there. My legs burned from the effort, but I couldn't stop. Couldn't let myself slow down. I didn't know what was behind me, but I knew I didn't want to find out. Finally, after what felt like hours, I broke through the trees and onto the dirt road that led to the parking lot. My car was still there, parked under the last light of the setting sun. I didn't even hesitate. I scrambled into the driver's seat, slammed the door, and locked it. I sat there for a long time, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. I don't know what I thought I'd seen or heard, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back into those woods. As I drove away, the trees and shadows receded in my rearview mirror. I was out of there, safe, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was still out there, watching, waiting, but I was done. I wasn't going back. I've always been the outdoorsy type, the kind of person who craves the quiet of the woods, the smell of pine in the air, and the challenge of a good hike. I've been on plenty of trails, some tough, some easy, but there was one that I thought would be simple. It was just a few miles, the kind of hike you can do in a few hours, even for someone like me who wasn't a seasoned expert but had enough experience to know how to handle a trail. It was late summer, early August. The weather was warm, but not too hot, with the sun high overhead and the sky clear. The trail was one of those popular ones that you see on every hiking website, a family-friendly type of hike, marked as an easy to moderate loop through a dense, beautiful forest that eventually opened up to a small, quiet lake. I had read the reviews, and while some people warned about a few tricky spots, nothing seemed too serious. I wasn't alone. My friend Dan was with me. We'd been hiking together before and had done longer, harder hikes, so this one was supposed to be a piece of cake. We had the usual hiking gear, water, snacks, maps, first aid kits. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. In fact, the first half of the hike went exactly as expected. We walked along the well-maintained trail, with the sunlight filtering through the trees, casting shadows on the forest floor. The sound of birds and the occasional rustle of animals in the underbrush kept the atmosphere calm. The trail was busy too, with other hikers scattered along the path, but it wasn't overcrowded. We took our time, stopping to take pictures, drink some water, and chat here and there. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. But that's when things started to feel off. It wasn't anything major at first. At some point, we lost sight of the other hikers. The trail narrowed, becoming a bit more overgrown. The trees seemed to close in around us, and the air grew heavier, less fresh. I didn't think much of it, just a shift in the environment, the kind of thing that happens when you venture off the beaten path. But there was something else too, something I couldn't shake. The quietness. The deeper we went into the woods, the quieter everything got. Not just in a natural way either, like animals moving away or birds stopping their calls. It was like all sound just disappeared, almost as if the forest was holding its breath. Dan noticed it too. "It's strange, isn't it?" he said, adjusting his pack and looking around. His voice sounded unusually loud in the stillness. He always had a way of saying things that made them feel heavier than they should be. I just nodded, not sure what to say. The silence was starting to get to me, and that wasn't something that usually bothered me. I liked the quiet, but this was different. This was thick, almost suffocating. We pressed on. The trail began to climb slightly, winding around boulders and through patches of thick brush. As we climbed, the trees grew even denser, and the light filtering through the canopy became dimmer. It was almost like the sky had turned a little darker, but I knew it couldn't be that late yet. The sun should have been high in the sky, but somehow it felt like it was slipping away. I checked my phone, no service. That was normal out here, no worries, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something I couldn't put my finger on. We reached a small clearing where the trail forked. The lake was supposed to be just a short walk from here, but something in the back of my mind told me to stop. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. The air was cold, despite the warmth of the day, and I suddenly felt a chill run through me, like I wasn't supposed to be here. "What do you think?" I asked Dan, trying to sound casual, though my voice was tight. Dan hesitated, looking at the fork in the trail. "I don't know. The map said both ways lead to the lake." I didn't argue. We took the left path, as it seemed to be a more direct route to the water. The ground was damp here, and the trail was softer, the mud sticking to our boots with each step. The trees were even closer now, almost crowding the trail, their twisted roots creeping across the path like fingers trying to grab us. We walked in silence for a while. My sense of unease grew, and I could tell Dan was feeling it too, though neither of us said anything. We kept moving, step after step, as if it would help shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. That's when we heard it. At first, it was barely a sound, like a distant rustle in the brush. But it was more than that. It was rhythmic, almost like footsteps, but too quick, too sharp. My eyes darted to the sides of the trail, but I didn't see anything. I slowed my pace, feeling my heart rate pick up. Dan didn't notice immediately, but I could see him stiffen once he caught the tension in my body. He looked around, squinting into the trees, his eyes scanning for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. We kept walking, but now there was a sense of urgency in our steps. We were closer to the lake, and I thought maybe reaching it would help calm whatever this was, this unsettling feeling that was growing stronger. But then it happened. The sound wasn't just a rustle anymore. It was louder, closer, like something was following us. I stopped. Dan stopped too, his gaze searching the trees. "What is that?" he asked, his voice low. I didn't answer. I just started walking faster, my boots crunching on the dirt, pushing myself forward without looking back. Whatever it was, I didn't want to see it. I had no idea what it was, but the air around me felt wrong. Heavy, thick, and suffocating. It felt like something was watching us, moving with us, staying just out of sight. We reached the lake in a hurry. The sight of the water did nothing to calm my nerves. If anything, it made things worse. The lake was still unnaturally so. Not a single ripple disturbed the surface. The trees surrounding it looked even more twisted than before, like they had grown into unnatural shapes. The sunlight had almost completely faded now, and I couldn't remember the last time I had seen the sky clearly. I turned to Dan, but before I could say anything, we heard it again. Closer, louder, and unmistakably human footsteps. We weren't alone. It was a warm, crisp morning when I set off. The kind of weather where the sun's rays feel perfect, and the air is fresh without being too hot or too cold. I decided on a solo hike up to the ridge trail I'd been meaning to explore for a while. I'm no stranger to hiking. In fact, it's one of the things I've always done to clear my mind, to think, to feel grounded again. But today was different. I wasn't exactly sure why, but something felt off. A weird sense of anticipation, maybe, or the odd quiet of the forest around me. It was as if the trees, the earth, and the wind were all holding their breath. I wasn't particularly nervous. I'm used to the wilderness. I've hiked many times, through forests, up mountains, across streams, and through deep valleys. But this trail was different. There was something about it that seemed untouched. Not by people, not by civilization. Maybe that's why I'd chosen it. The start of the trail was near a small, quiet town. I parked my truck at a nearly empty lot, grabbed my pack, and started off. The first stretch was easy, the ground soft but firm underfoot. I followed the well-marked path, winding through the dense trees, the smell of pine and earth thick in the air. The sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting shifting patterns of light on the ground. I felt at ease, maybe a little too at ease.